English Shared Futures this year. How lovely to see you all. Becky, are people still arriving, or?
People are still arriving. I'll just let them in as they pop in.
Fantastic. Well, as I say, welcome and thank you all very much for coming. Gail.
We're really grateful to you for coming today, and we're grateful to you for the continuing participation of our partner institutions in English Shared Futures. So just to run through them, and I know that some of them are represented in the room today, we work very closely with the National Association of Writers in Education, Norway, with Nate, Rachel Roberts is here, the National Association for the Teaching of English, with University English, of course, and we're glad to have Alex Thompson here as its chair, English Association, and the Institute of English Studies. So we're grateful to all of these institutions and associations for their participation and their help. Bob and I, though, are actually all of us are mostly grateful to Becky, who's here as the CEO of the English Association, who as well has been one of the most, if not the most competent and capable person I've ever worked with, is also the most generous and the most fun to work with too. And we are all massively in her debt for today and for many other things besides. So thank you very much, Becky.
Absolutely, thank you, Becky, and thank you to people who have felt able to contribute financially to the session today as well. Very, very much appreciated.
It really is. The English Association is. Sorry, Bob.
Go.
So as Bob said, this is the first of our summer events for English Shared Futures this year. We're planning to hold at least one more at the end of June, beginning of July, which will include, we hope, a talk from a big name creative writer and also a session that will be run by our PGR and ECA colleagues. We're very aware of the difficulties that they've been in this year, so we'll look forward to hearing from them in a couple of months.
And we have some other news too. Anthony.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I'm pleased to announce that I've been in contact with the Royal Northern College of Music recently, and we have some provisional dates for the next face-to-face English Shared Futures Conference, which is Friday the 8th of July to Sunday the 10th of July. That, of course, is not this year, 2022. There's obviously lots of things that have to be put in place before that. We have to hope everything gets back to normal. We have to hope it's the same next June and July. We have to get various organisational committees in place, and my mind boggles when I think about where we were in March last year when we're almost about to deliver the conference, and of course had to stop. And they also, apparently, the Royal Northern College of Music have some exciting new rooms, including Studio 8, which I'm looking forward to seeing. I'm really looking forward to seeing everybody again face to face, all those different sessions going on in various parts of the Royal Northern College of Music.
That's really great news. Thanks very much, Anthony, because you've been really pulling that together at the Manchester end of things. So we're really grateful to you for keeping on with that. And just looking at all the names of people coming through this morning, the desire to be in the same room as people and to talk like this is almost overwhelming. So it's great to have that to look forward to next year. So just before we get started, a quick word about how this is all going to work. So as we've become used to already, if you could put any comments you have in the chat, and the chairs of each individual session will collate those questions and put them to our speakers at the end. So do pop them in the chat any time during the sessions. So we'll be starting in a minute with Ben Davies and Tina Lupton talking about their project on reading during the pandemic. We'll have a 20-minute break before we come back to hear from some of our learning societies about what they've been doing over the past year. And then we'll end with a conversation between Corinne Fowler and Raj Pal. They'll be talking about Corinne's book, Green Unpleasant Land. So that's what we've got lined up for the rest of this morning. So I'll hand over to Bob now, who's going to chair the first session.
Thank you so much, Gail, and thank you, Anthony, as well. So our first session, today's whole morning is about caring for discipline during COVID. So very pleased to have the first session, Corona Time, Reading During the Pandemic. The two speakers are Dr. Ben Davies, who is Secretary of University English. He's also Senior Lecturer in English Literature at Portsmouth, author of Sex, Time and Space in Contemporary Fiction, 2016, and co-editor of John Burnside's Contemporary Critical Perspectives and Sex, Gender and Time in Fiction and Culture, 2020 and 2011. We've also, with him is Professor Tina Lupton, currently on secondment to the University of Copenhagen, where she directs the School of English, Germanic and Romance Languages. She's also a professor at Warwick. Her most recent book is Reading in the Making of Time, and which is also the author of Knowing Books, The Consciousness of Mediation in 18th Century Britain, 2012. They're working on a Carlsberg-funded project on lockdown reading, and I guess this is part of the results of that project. Please.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks, everyone. So we're going to do a bit of a double act here, and Ben is going to be the slides person, and I'm going to start reading before I switch over to Ben. So we're really glad to have the chance to present this material today, which draws on a project that we've been running for the last 8 months, looking at the role that novel reading has played in the lives of readers living through the coronavirus lockdowns in Denmark and in England. In the round, we do want to share with you some of our findings, which we've gathered via 2 national surveys and a series of in-depth interviews with readers across the year. These interviews point in general not only to evidence of people reading more novels in this last year, but also to people reading with a new sort of intensity and intention. Many of the interviews that we've done work in themselves as a strong vote of confidence for the way novels have become something worth caring for and caring about, and as a medium for different types of care this year. We thought we'd begin with a taste of what we mean with the voices of some of the UK readers interviewed by Ben, in which we hear from them directly. So we've got 3 different readers speaking here. And then, like I said, finding the evenings quite difficult and quite long, the going to bed early and reading a book felt a bit an act of self-care and a nice way to look after myself and be like, well, you've got to switch off from work now because you're literally in bed winding down. So I think there's a lot of comfort and a lot of, I guess, familiarity and routine for me in the practice of reading. And I suppose you're not thinking about other stuff because whereas, like I said, when you're watching TV, you're on your phone, on Twitter, which is just such a void of despair, or you're watching the news, you're scanning news on your phone. And I feel like you're not shutting the world out. Whereas when you read, you can't really be distracted by anything else. So it's a little bit of space away from thinking about the situation.
Yeah, I think more time, and I guess also the need to entertain myself. I obviously would normally see people quite a lot at work. I'd normally be going out and meeting people. So the books also helped me cope quite a lot during the long periods of being alone. And for most of lockdown, I didn't have a partner as well. So I very much felt quite alone, and having all these books with me made me feel a bit more connected to the world around me.
Reading is a constant. It's always there. It's always comforting. And I'm trying to think, it's not subject to external influences. So it doesn't matter what lockdown restrictions are. It doesn't matter about anything else. I have complete control over what I'm reading. So I think probably that as well, feeling of having some control over it. It's definitely a comfort. Obviously, this year's been quite isolating, but I am quite a solitary person anyways. And I think reading is a better use of my time than going on social media or just generally staring at a screen.
We find these kinds of statements incredibly moving, a real galvanizing of optimism about the future of the novel. And we've gathered tons of them, evidence from people of all educational backgrounds, ages, and geographical locations that suggest how important novels have been to them in surviving this last year. As first-year Newcastle University student Imogen said, reading literally carried me through this pandemic. These statements then are in themselves a powerful antidote to the kind of skepticism afoot in the academy about the future of literature as a field of study or the capacity of students to read as they used to.
So we are going to get back to the happy note of that argument, but we want to pan out for a minute by asking what it might mean to study this kind of material, this data. What role might the claims of non-professional readers living through a particular historical moment play in our own understanding of our discipline? How can we use these avid statements of caring for books to inform the ways we study and write about them more critically? We thought we'd start the talk today with these larger questions in order to give you a sense of what we've been doing and how the evidence we've been collecting of people caring very much about reading under these conditions of historical emergency might be lodged within the Literary Critical Academy as things to work with and to study, not just from the perspective of sociologists, but as literary critics. So when Ben and I were first applying for money for this project last summer, we both knew that we wanted to collect data about what and how real people were reading through the strange times of 2020. We'd both worked in the past on fiction as an interface with time and on the reader as a figure that mattered to what fictions actually say. In my case, this had involved working on a long history of people using books to set aside and anticipate the kinds of time they valued, either for self-development or for leisure. Unlike other kinds of reading, for instance, newspapers or the internet reading or work reports, I saw book reading historically as a supplement to our everyday lives of work and reproduction, a way of annexing time for ourselves or for the future. Ben's work in his book here was more contemporary, but it also focused on readings of recent novels that present the reader as having an exceptional relationship to the text, a presence vital to the narrative, but outside the space and time it represents. The time you bring to a book as a reader, for instance, is vital to the operation of that book. It is outside the time of that story in important ways. A story about crisis or confinement changes when reading is figured into that scene. A text that describes the shortness of time, for example, will always in this sense expand that economy by being a text that is read. A text that is boring will supplement that by being something of interest. What Ben and I had in common as scholars was our interest in that interface between what a text says about space and time, what it's about, and the way practices of reading get added to the mix in the context of a book being read. The fact that we were interested in both the reality of reading and in what text said already made us somewhat unusual amongst our colleagues. And I guess this is also the sort of story of how we found each other under these unusual circumstances. Typically in our discipline, scholars will be focused on literature as content or on its reception. To put this in concrete terms, a literary critic looking, let's say, at the subject of the plague in literature would probably focus on novels that feature that kind of event. The critic might then use social theory, Bakhtin or Foucault, to help decode the representations of fictional disasters or unusual moments in time as part of a cultural history. Or they might take a more historical approach and focus on an actual event in history like the Spanish flu and explore the resonance between fictional representations of that event and actual archives from that moment. More rarely, you might also find someone in a literature department taking what we describe as a more book historical approach to a topic like plague. In the case of pandemic, this critic might look at the way government material describing the Spanish flu, let's say, influenced the printing and circulation of more literary material in the 1920s, or the way actual book circulation happened in the 1920s as a result of plague. Our colleague Leah Price at Rutgers in the US is interested, and this is the cover of her recent book, in how library books were perceived in the past as vectors of contagion and how this contrasts with the way they're seen now as things we retreat with. Book historical approaches like Price's focus on the materiality of the text, its production and circulation, and they engage less closely, at least in her recent work, with the content of books. It's a perfectly legitimate thing in this register to track the interface between literature and public health without producing any reading of plague fiction.
These kind of book historical approaches are adjacent to the sociological ones, in which scholars look more broadly at the material phenomenon of literary production or circulation in social terms. Jim English, one of the literary sociologists whose work we're using in our study, studies, for instance, the role of the online platform Goodreads in shaping today's literary taste. Research into book circulation or readers' behavior often occurs at this scale, largely because big data, so using data scraping or online corpus or mass publication or download records, facilitates broad conclusions. And you might, for instance, find studies of 2020 reading habits that describe in numerical terms how many more books have been written and sold in 2020 in various countries, and also the sorts of studies that look at how words like care or illness or epidemic, pandemic spike as keywords. And we can also pretty confidently predict, based on our project, that we'll see a lot of work on the way audiobooks have become more popular this year.
So quotes like the ones we began with will certainly consolidate these kinds of sociological and book historical findings. And it's been one of our objectives in running this project to provide a detailed archive that historians in the future who are interested in those big pictures can use to finesse their findings. But to come back quickly to the larger methodological question of what it might mean to incorporate care of the kind that readers have expressed for novels into what our own discipline does, we would also like to stress what we are trying out now in our own approach as critics, which is the idea that the time a reader spends with a book, gives to a book, is something that should be studied as integral to its content.
This is there in, for example, Martha Nussbaum's argument for the morality of literature as something that lies in the quality of attention that a fictional world has been given. So in her account, a narrative does not come to us like reality. It arrives in the form of a world where the narrator has thought about and spent detail with every aspect of character and interaction. It models in this construction an ideal state of attentiveness into which people might enter if they have the opportunity, reading figures in this construction as the more realistic version of the kind of attention that a narrator gives, though it too suggests the idea of an exceptional kind of time being made for such engagement with the world.
This hypothesis is explored in the novel Severance, a post-apocalyptic story written 2 years before our own real pandemic. Here, the first-person narrator is speculating about what she and her friends hoped might happen in the aftermath of a severe storm in New York City. A day off meant we could do things we'd always meant to do, like go to the botanical garden, the Frick collection or something, read some fiction. Leisure, the problem with the modern condition was the dearth of leisure. And finally, it took a force of nature to interrupt our routines. We just wanted to hit the reset button. We just wanted to feel flush with time to do things of no quantifiable value. Our hopeful side pursuits like writing or drawing or something other than we did for money, like learn to be a better photographer. And even if we didn't get around to it on that day, our free day, maybe it was enough to feel the possibility that we could if we wanted to, which is another way of saying that we wanted to feel young, though many of us were that, if nothing else. In the novel, this day never comes. When a pandemic arrives, survival does not come with leisure.
Similarly, in our real version of this experience of disaster, many people have found themselves with less time, not more time, and many discussed even being troubled by time itself. And many of the interviews we've conducted, we had people discussing gaining a sort of hyper-awareness of time, brought about largely by the blurring of work-life balances, endless days on furlough for some, or the diminished visibility of any future horizon. One interviewee, for example, addressed reading's temporal demands and the sort of associated anxieties when she said she didn't want to begin Ulysses, which she'd bought and was sitting next to her in case she didn't finish it. And she really couldn't cope with feeling like a failure in this already stressful time. Perhaps more disturbingly, one reader in Bournemouth was troubled by the very idea of beginning Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light, which was published in March of last year, telling me, I thought, what if I die before I get to the end of this? I couldn't die and not know what happened. So where perhaps literary critics such as Frank Kermode and Peter Brooks position the end of the novel as a type of metaphorical death, the point at which the realization of the anticipation of retrospection can be achieved, here the real fear of dying from COVID was experienced as a barrier to reading itself, a fear of dying in the midst of narrative. So rather than thinking about the written narrative as a model through which to explore time, we see here how the felt and lived experience of time can affect the reading experience, especially during certain temporal and spatial conditions such as lockdown, and also how readerly experiences can disrupt and enrich such narrative modeling. So our interviews with readers indicate that while some may have had more time for reading in lockdown, plenty of obstacles, practical and psychological, still remained, especially as death often felt close at hand. So many of our interviewees disclose how attention doesn't simply flow from reader to the fictional world undivided uninterrupted in some sort of ideal immersive reading. Rather, the reading, they show, is always broken with schedules and divisions of work, caring, cleaning, and so on and so forth. And much happens in the intervals between reading, leading to an intricate sort of mixture of life and narrative. Moreover, lockdown often exacerbated the divisions and partitions, the blurring of routines, and the division between work and life balance. Consequently then, under lockdown, attention as a moral program becomes as much an exercise in ring-fencing time and shifting modes of attention, rather than just generously attending to a text.
Here's an example from Denmark. This is Alan, a Danish parent of young children, discussing these kinds of time pressures and the blurring of work with life. It was absolutely awful. So I stopped reading the day that Mette Frederiksen closed Denmark. It was really bad because we were suddenly going to have to look after our children at home. We have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, and at the same time we had to keep working. I have a full-time job. So in the British context, we might want to put this in the context of Danish childcare being absolutely impeccable, in the sense that everyone has it freely, basically, from when their children are very young. So this is a Danish parent expressing horror at the fact that the children are not going to be looked after in their local daycare centre. But after a while, Alan started reading again, making time for reading and using reading as a way to add some structure to his now unstructured days. I somehow tried to find a new rhythm, he says. So he would plot time in his calendar for reading, and he would plan to go somewhere to read, typically into the woods, sitting on a bench, as there was nowhere else to go. One of the works he reads in this context is My Struggle, Knausgård's My Struggle, a fiction that describes in groundbreaking detail the everyday life of small children at home. Alan goes on, I think that in a life situation characterized by corona and an everyday life with jobs and young children, reading fiction can maintain focus and maintain the longer, deeper conversation over time.
Alan is not alone in this line of reasoning. Other people have found themselves with less time and have nonetheless read more. Moreover, many have used reading as a way to manage their time and a means to care, both for themselves and for others. So Sophia, a woman in her 30s who was self-isolating in her London apartment for pretty much an entire year, turned exclusively to audiobooks in lockdown to care for herself and give herself time away from her husband, because they were both sort of trapped in their apartment together. And listening to Anna Karenina narrated by the actress Tamarin Payne allowed Sophia to create a sort of private audio bubble, or as she put it in her own words, a type of unity, as soon as she put in her noise cancelling headphones. And she recalls that once she switched from the physical print book to the audio version, this gave me endless pleasure, 33 hours of blissful time. And she talks about the way in which the associated guilt with sitting down and taking hours to read a physical print book fell away. And what's also interesting, she often deliberately moved as well when she was listening. So she sort of transformed that sitting down and reading activity into something physical. And pleasure and bliss sort of replace here guilt and inactivity. And she talks about the way in which time is no longer wasted, but almost given to her. But there are, of course, still real pulls on her attention, which arise, as she says in her own words, there were times where I'd choose Tolstoy over my husband. I preferred his words and his thoughts to my husband's. And she often chose time to spend with Tolstoy rather than her husband, identifying with the world to which Tolstoy's narrator gives attention. And she notes that there is also a mundanity in the marriages of the characters, which chimed with my experience of lockdown when you're cooped up with your partner for a very long time and they become increasingly boring. So the monotony of isolation resonates for Sophia with Tolstoy's stifled marriages. Her husband becomes boring, but she herself is able to mitigate this by paying attention to narrative, fenced off in this sort of audio narrative world. She says that the solution was to start an affair, which I didn't, but I could live that life vicariously through Anna. So the time she makes for listening and the attention Sophia pays to the text enable her to attend to herself and her desires, forms and paradigms of life. Throughout the project, we've also discovered and found that time for reading was not only used during the last 12 months as a way to avoid others. Eva, a secondary school teacher we interviewed, deliberately rereads Jane Eyre with her daughter as a form of caring and parenting, a shared mother-daughter activity, whilst they're both in lockdown in the house rather than as teacher and at school as teacher and pupil. And this offers just one of the examples of the importance we've looked at in terms of rereading. Lots of people have returned to books that they've read at earlier times, and deliberately so. In her interview, Eva discusses her daughter's first reading as much as her own rereading, commenting at length on her daughter's engagement with the novel. So she said, for example, "I don't think my daughter's old enough to get all of it. She understood how awful the teachers were in the school, and she occasionally refers to the scene in the Red Room, which was pretty horrifying for her. She was trying to get her head around how mean the aunt was, Mrs. Reed and the cousins, but I don't think she's old enough to get all the shifts. She got the main gist of it, like Mr. Rochester not being a great character, but she's too young to see parallels with lockdown and being locked in. She didn't get the birth of stuff at all. I think it was too much for her to understand." So through this form of reading as care, Eva sees the text through her own rereading, which puts her in touch with a variety of former times and former selves. And she also sees the text partly through her daughter's reading. So once again here, we see the potential books can give to play with time and with perspectives in time. Reading and rereading has for many offered a form of control, as well as a way of losing oneself in past times and with past selves during a time over the last 12 months in which many felt powerless. Such recursions and returns can, moreover, proleptically conjure future times and future selves. For instance, the daughter who will one day understand more of the novel, indicating that rereading under lockdown has also been as much about the future as it has the present and the past, former lives and former selves.
As the writer Zadie Smith puts it in the essays that she wrote and published in 2020, lockdown has exposed everyone to a problematic that self-employed artists and writers have long understood on a daily basis: time and what to do with it. The general takeaway here is that books are a way of producing a break in attention, for making time when it is not there, of holding space for the kinds of otherness and perspective that books introduce. I think, and this is one of our readers, I think it's because I had the chance to, well, I had the time to spend on them, but also it wasn't just that I had the time, it's that I had large blocks of time. So it meant that I could become completely absorbed in that book. And so there were no distractions, there was no time limit. You know, I didn't need to think about the end of my lunch break. I could just sit and I could just read until I didn't want to anymore. And that was really nice. I guess that felt like a massive, because I mean, reading in itself is obviously escapism, but I guess that this was then extra escapism, because I was escaping from adult life and responsibilities and deadlines. And it was just reading until I wanted to stop.
As well as using this time to escape, as we've seen, people have read as a means of caring and parenting within the lockdown home. And many interviewees discussed how they read novels in order to learn and educate themselves, to encounter, to immerse themselves, to challenge themselves, in short, to think. And there's a great article, recent article by Lindsay Stonebridge in the New Statesman, which is worth looking at on this, these sorts of forms of reading and why we read. In particular, many interviewees discussed actively seeking out works by African-American authors in the wake of George Floyd's murder and last year's BLM protests. As one reader put it, she was really sick of reading books by white people. And for her, it was the intensity of being locked down and trapped in a house that actually drove her to open up her reading to a wider range of voices, which she hadn't previously felt the need to do. Many interviewees also discuss the tension between, on the one hand, wanting to participate and be active in last year's protests and the constraints of lockdown. So for example, Lisa in the north of England recalled, I didn't really feel comfortable going on marches due to COVID-19, but at the very least I could learn more and also put money towards Black-owned bookshops. Spending time with novels for such purposes resonates, for example, with Toni Morrison's understanding of the ways in which, as she puts it in her Norton lectures at Harvard, narrative fiction provides a controlled wilderness, an opportunity to be and to become the other, the stranger, with sympathy, clarity, and the risk of self-examination. The readers we've interviewed often talked about testing themselves to seek out more diverse literature, to read fiction about lives different from their own, to read about historic and present day struggles, and the importance of doing so, especially at a time when they often felt trapped and limited. So they were, in some ways, in Morrison's words, using the novel to step into a controlled wilderness, where, of course, with certain forms of privilege and safety, they were at least attempting to use the novel and fiction to learn about and experience other lives, to experience other times and care through novels. The purpose of such interviews, the purpose of reading such interviews suggest is actually the opposite of mere escapism. Rather, it's a deliberate attempt to encounter other lives, an attempt to challenge oneself and explore, among other things, constructions of identity. But just to return briefly to the idea of escapism itself, the idea that reading is a way to escape, it's a much more complex idea and concept than the usual reduction of literature to entertainment. As one self-isolating reader in London explained, he reread Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate to escape lockdown by deliberately re-entering a narrative world he had found to be much worse. Unable to get out of his house, he immersed himself in the Battle of Stalingrad. So this was a type of escape into devastation, which necessarily unfolds over a period of quite lengthy reading. And this immersive experience didn't just offer a form of escape, but put lockdown into a different perspective. Fiction enabled a type of thinking for this reader about his present moment via attention to the past, which involves attention over time. Tina, I think you're muted. I think that was when I shared the screen.
Yeah. Okay. Our interviewees give a clear sense of the importance of time to novel reading. They also disclose in wonderful detail the many ways in which they made time to attend to narrative and for a rich variety of purposes, protecting themselves, parenting, exploring, and confronting as a means of escape and thinking. In this sense, one version of caring for our discipline might be to see it as dependent upon the kinds of time we make and find and give ourselves, to understand literature and its reception as intimately bound up with what seem like more political projects of limiting and shaping the work week, the lifetime. Lockdown has given us a chance to see up close and under laboratory-like conditions how powerfully novels and our experience of time can operate as mutually defining forces. If readers have more leisure time, but also have more agency in the ways they make and divide up the time they have, time becomes an attribute of text and story, a fundament of what literature means and why we care about it. The challenge and the opportunity for the discipline is to harness the care people have shown for novels during this time into forms of care for the study of literature, which we propose involves rethinking readerly time and engagement with readers, not merely in terms of public engagement, but by rethinking the role of the reader as central to the literary critical work that we do. Thanks very much.
Thank you both very much. That was really interesting and full of amazing things. I want to branch off and discuss. The first thing we're going to discuss is please put your questions in the chat, everybody, and we'll go through. But while you were talking, a very interesting conversation on the chat emerged about audiobooks. Dinah and Anna and Jenny, do you want to unmute Dinah and talk through your question in the chat?
Thanks, Bob. Yes, I was very struck in the recent event I did for students here at the University of Liverpool on reading fiction. And they did predominantly say that what they've been doing is using audiobooks largely in their exercise routines, in fact. So while they're out walking or trying to keep fit, they use audio books. But I do think it's worth exploring some of the, I think, really quite radical and essential differences of our experiences of fiction in that medium. Interesting to think about why, just on that very small sample, obviously, but why it is so popular. And the fact that you no longer have quite that intimate relationship that you were talking about when you talked, for instance, about Tolstoy, Anna Karenina, between your own response, the novelist, the characters, because of course an audiobook is always mediated. You're always hearing another voice. And if it's dramatized, and many of them are, you're hearing several voices, which necessarily introduces a layer of interpretation into your experience of the fiction. So I do think it's an interesting development. I don't know how long lasting it will be, and I don't know the extent to which it's a product of the pandemic. Might have been something that was already perhaps more deeply established, more embedded than I had understood before the pandemic hit us. But I'll be interested to hear what you feel, what others feel about that. I think it is a very important shift.
Well, if I step in first to answer this with my 18th centuryist hat on and then hand over to Ben. But I mean, Dinah, in terms of, as an 18th centuryist, I would say that your point about voice as a mediator for text, I mean, a book historian like Abigail Williams at Oxford would say texts, in the 18th century, texts were primarily read aloud. So voice was a mediator of narrative long before print was, and that lasted much longer than we think. And of course, for our kids and for many of the stories that we've heard from this year, people are reading aloud with teenagers, for instance, as an activity. So if the question is about what the role of voice as a medium as opposed to print is, then I think we can say that they have both played a role as media in the history of things being delivered. So I mean, we've talked a lot about this, so we have in our group, so we can say a lot of things. So, but I'll just start with that one, and then Ben, maybe hand over to you to say a bit more.
Yeah, that's interesting, Dinah, about starting with students, because last year on one of the student evaluations for my contemporary fiction module, one of the comments was, I'm very disappointed that none of the books you've chosen have audio versions, because they're very contemporary. So. And it hadn't really occurred to me, actually, I hadn't even thought about that as an issue. I thought we were there to read as such, and I hadn't really quite gauged how for some students and people more generally, actually audio is becoming a predominant form rather than the physical print book. I think that's partly exacerbated by lockdown, but as you said, I think this trend was already there. And Jenny Richards asked, Matthew Gruber's book traces that long history of the audiobook. And we see that emerging. I think with the case I was giving, Sophia, which is one of my favorite interviews I did actually, she talked interestingly, first of all, about being very distracted by sitting and reading, whereas a lot of the interviewees talk that sitting with a book was sort of a barrier that allowed them to focus. And for her, it was sort of shielding, putting her noise cancelling headphones off that allowed her to enter this world. And in terms of the voices and mediation, I think the other interesting thing there was that she tried about 10 different versions with different narrators before settling on that version. And it was that version she settled on, partly because she had a woman narrator, and that's what she wanted. So I think it really depends on the situation in terms of where people were in lockdown. And for her, and I think for a lot of people, as you're talking, it also allows for multitasking in ways that sitting with a physical book doesn't. In terms of sort of future predictions, I think I would probably guess that audiobooks will continue to be more and more popular for all the reasons we said. Possibly when sort of lockdowns are lifted and people become sort of on the move again much more. So that would be a prediction, not that I haven't got any stakes in that as such. But I think Matthew Ruber's book, to answer Jenny's question, is possibly one of the best on this subject from a historical perspective.
Can I ask Anna and Jenny to come in that order, and just to speak to their comments or speak to the conversation about audiobooks. So Anna first, if you want to speak, feel free to unmute, and if you don't, that's also fine too. Okay, Jenny, do you want to come in and speak to your comments?
Yeah, so first of all, Ben and Gina, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic panel. I really love the theme that you've taken about care for the discipline. But then, because I work on voice and text, I was really excited by what you had to say about audiobooks. And I wondered whether a part of your project under the heading Care for the Discipline might also turn towards including the things that we've not been looking at. And I think that literary studies, like the history of the book, like the history of rhetoric, which is my area, has seen itself as silent for far too long. But there is an intrinsic connection between text and the performative, whether it's reading aloud or whether it's a full-blown dramatization. And I think that we've not, as a discipline, really embraced that. There's lots of work from, there's work on the recovery of the importance of delivery in the teaching of reading in earlier periods. There's a lot of work on the sound of reading that engages with, I mean, there's quite a substantial bibliography, but I think if one thing that came out of this, your project, could be that we engaged a bit more with sound, performative, the audio as part of the reading experience. And the last thing I'd say is that the thing that's really, that it's been so hard, so that when people who write about the sound of writing or audiobooks, they're having to push at quite strong expectations of the field of study that writing and reading are basically silent. But thank you so much. I was so excited by this.
Well, I mean, Jenny, I can only endorse what you're saying on a personal level by saying that I guess I wasn't a big audiobook user myself, and I hadn't really thought about this, although I must say in the classroom I've always, as a teacher, insisted that students do a lot of reading aloud. So I've always, that performative aspect has always been part of my teaching practice. But my partner had a stroke a couple of years ago, and she is an academic and an avid reader. And since that stroke, she's not able to read print. So she does all her reading at this audio level. And this for me was, of course, this is a radical adjustment, because what I've seen is that, I mean, she reads more than me still, but she does it all by listening. And it's really made me sort of rethink any assumptions I had about the idea that listening is a lesser form of narrative engagement, because that's so obviously not true in her case. But one thing I would say in relation to this multitasking idea, the idea that audiobook is sort of efficient, which is true, of course, and we have lots of stories from people saying, oh, well, my only way to read during the pandemic was to have, Pride and Prejudice playing on on in the background while I was making dinner for the kids. But it must also be recognized, I think, that audio form consumption of text is very time consuming. So it does not take 35 hours to read, War and Peace. It won't take me 35 hours to read War and Peace probably, but it will take 35 hours plus to listen to it. So Heather and I also have this very sort of complicated relationship to text where I'm like, come on, you really want me to read out loud the new Ishiguro text? That's going to mean that we have to read it every evening for the next 2 weeks, whereas I could get through that in one evening if I just read it. So there is an inefficiency to listening as well that I think has to be factored in. It's not just a shortcut to a text, it's actually a long path to a text. And in terms of the attention stuff that we've been talking about, it does require you to attend for a long time to a text to get through it in audio form. So I hear what you're saying and fully agree. And I have been myself a convert to the argument that you're making just at that personal level in the last years.
Yeah, I also, if I can just step in, Jenny, I think your question about the discipline also relates to what we might think in terms of Felske's work about thinking more about the uses of literature and doing more on that in the classroom. I think positioning literature within the sort of contemporary, our moment and what people do with literature and how they deal with it and in all its different forms and varieties, I think that is probably something the discipline would benefit from. Yeah.
Can I turn to Melissa's question? Again, Melissa, if you'd like to unmute and speak to what you've written in the comments, very welcome, but also I can just articulate it if you prefer. Well, the question is, first, Melissa thanks you, and she says, I wonder if you could say a little bit more, please, about the kinds of novels people have been choosing to read. Were there certain titles, genres that tend to emerge more strongly than others?
Yeah, I mean, we've had to sort of, what we've done is basically organize the book we're writing as a response to that question. So the best thing we can probably do is give you a run through of the different categories that we've ended up organizing our chapters into. So we have a chapter on people reading stuff that is actually related to pandemic in some way, referential stuff, everything from, the Decameron right up to the Pull of the Stars. So obviously there's been huge spike in that kind of reading. Then we have a chapter on people reading stuff that's like the Knausgård reading, people like Rachel Cusk or Knausgård or Maggie Nelson, stuff that's very in this sort of new auto-fictional genre about the conditions of being at home, struggling to read and write. So that has that sort of referential quality to it, which some people have said, oh God, there's no way I would want to read about being stuck at home with small kids under these conditions. But for other people, they've really enjoyed reading stuff that seems to document that sort of experience. And then we have a chapter on rereading and rereading classics, the people who've chosen to sort of dip back into their own book collections and read things that were just sitting there on the shelf. They haven't picked up Jane Eyre for 20 years. Now's the moment. Then we have the chapter that Ben just referenced about reading about Black Lives Matter, reading about race, reading as a form of political engagement. Which categories am I missing, Ben?
There's also the long reads chapter, because at the very beginning of lockdown, there are all these sort of wonderfully optimistic articles and opinion pieces saying now is the time to read Proust, now is the time to read X, Y, and Z, whichever long novel you can think of. And a lot of people did buy into that. But obviously that's more complex and complicated than those sort of comments were. So that's another chapter. A lot of people did pick up, at least, not necessarily finishing Proust. That was often seen as the sort of ideal lockdown read. And then you also track, it's quite interesting to track the way people follow contemporary fiction. So big novels that are popular were Hilary Mantel's late at the end of the trilogy, then Ali Smith's Summer. And there are readers who pretty much just track those sort of new big publication events. That's another category.
Yeah.
Crime fiction is one of the top categories, according to all of you can see that in the BBC surveys and stuff. And are we missing anything there?
No, I think we've got it.
So we have a question from Naomi, and again, then if you want to unmute, feel free. And if not, I'll ventriloquize for you. So go.
Sorry, it is quite long. I think I've summarised it in the chat as well as I can. But I found, I found the experience, particularly your opening quotations of your readers, deeply moving. But it sort of raised, I guess, a couple of questions in my mind. One in terms of the like how lockdown might be not obviously just different for different people, but divided into different periods of time, and thinking particularly in terms of my experience as a teaching academic, and your question about where we stand as carers for the discipline. And because certainly some of your interviewees' experience sort of resonated with me with that initial experience of lockdown as being one where suddenly we were sort of reconfiguring our time and making space for reading and discovering the pleasures of the discipline. And it felt really exciting to me. I had additional time at home. My university sort of made accommodations for students in cutting down the amount of teaching and marking. I found a sort of bunch of really exciting things going online in terms of things like literary festivals, and posted them up for my students. And it felt a very exciting time. But the experience of this year has been completely different. And I just know that many of my colleagues are so exhausted. And I'm sort of really conscious of, not just keeping my students engaged on track in the course, but keeping them enthused, excited about literature, which is then kind of adding to the labour of, and the kind of emotional labour that goes with that. I'm particularly interested you choose that word, carers for the discipline, because it becomes almost a kind of care work, which I really worry is actually sort of taking a greater toll on us as the carers of the discipline, if you like.
Well, I guess a couple of things come to mind. I don't really have an answer as such, but one of the things about doing the project over, like doing the interviews, not just at the first lockdown, but throughout, is we've actually been able to track readers' responses throughout different phases. And it's interesting to see how the different lockdowns affected their reading. So that's one thing. In terms of the discipline, I think everyone's exhausted. I think students are exhausted. And I think for me, and I read about this last year for the English Association journal piece, I think the care aspect is, as much as the online stuff is good and it allows for all sorts of things, I think there is something that students essentially miss about being in the seminar room with other people. And I think there's something about that embodied sharing that's essential. And I do worry that as academics, we might not be the ones to decide how this is going to move forward, to use a terrible phrase, into the future. It may be management more than everyday academics. But I think I'd be terribly sad and disappointed if this virtual world became the norm. So that's one thing I'd say about care. In terms of keeping them motivated, my own experience this year has been difficult. Students have sort of dropped in and out, but the one session that seemed to be the most lively was the one session I actually did on pandemic reading and the lockdown, because they shared in all their experiences. And I think, again, that comes back to this sort of Felsky idea about thinking about how people use literature and not just sort of analysing and critiquing. I think that sort of use, the everyday use of literature is one of the ways in which care is not just us showing care, but also the way in which we can engage with the care that our students give to literature beyond and in the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I'm sitting here in Copenhagen today, and it is the season of public holidays in Denmark. It's also the season that the Danish government has decided we can reopen the universities. And it's very interesting to me that basically as spring gets going and public holidays in Denmark start, we have almost I mean, basically April and May in Denmark are 4-day weeks, basically all of them, all of the weeks. And, you know, no one's coming into the university because everybody's out in the parks and at their summer houses and, you know, on the beach. And this for me is very Danish, but I mean, a place like Denmark really has a lot to teach us, I think, about care generally as a sort of care of the self kind of country that doesn't always translate into, you know, the highest level academic achievement. But when it comes to something like reading, we can see that, you know, the sort of very high levels of literacy in Denmark and some of the stuff that we've collected here in Denmark this year just does directly correlate with the willingness of Danes to unplug from work life, which, you know, unfortunately in the UK and the US is just, you know, not there at the sort of as part of the cultural, one of the cultural values. Like the sort of cultural value placed on non-work time in Denmark is extraordinary, and it really does result in this kind of uptake of opportunities for reading and leisure. So it's interesting. I mean, for us, it's interesting to have those two countries in play, I think, as we track the unfolding of the year. And yeah, I mean, the exhaustion of my colleagues in the UK, you know, it really strikes me as incredibly painful at this point in the pandemic, because it didn't have to be that way. It doesn't feel quite that way in Denmark. And it you know, the fact that academics have been ground you know, down by this experience in the way that they have is a choice, and it has to do with how a culture, you know, plays something like this out. So all I can say, Naomi, is that I you know, I'm very, very sensitive to the fact that there have been different seasons of this, and that there are different cultural versions of this, and that there are better and worse ones of it, and that there are many lessons to be learned there about how to treat teachers and students and workers generally under these kinds of conditions of pressure.
Naomi, do you want to speak back to any of those responses?
Thank you very much. That's very interesting to hear about yeah, how things are happening in Denmark, and I'm sure like me and my colleagues sort of really appreciate your thought and understanding. I'm not sure I have any sort of specific follow-up questions or queries. I mean, it'd be interesting to I guess to reflect on something where an association like English Shared Futures sort of comes into play in this. I went to some of your events sort of early on last year and found it one of the most sort of moving and exciting and infusing things at the beginning of, yeah, sort of, well, relatively near the beginning of lockdown. But yes, I think many of us are perhaps getting to the point where the exhaustion is regrettably the utmost feeling.
No, I think we all hear that.
Sorry, I think this sort of chimes in, but I'm just looking at the question. I think this sort of resonates with some questions from Dinah, and there's a discussion about reading groups and stuff, reading not being solitary. That's something else we've seen a lot of in the project, the sort of boom and flourishing of particularly online communities and shared reading, and a way of breaking this solitary experience that a lot of people have had over lockdown. And one of the interesting aspects of that is the way in which people often they deliberately talked about their reading when they phoned people, because they had nothing else to talk about and they didn't want to talk about the pandemic. So I completely agree with the conversation in here about the importance of shared reading and online reading groups and book groups.
Anthony, you have a question about the novel, kind of the novel versus the book, or the novel and the book. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Yeah, but I was just struck in those, I think it's the first three quotations that the interviewee seemed to be referring to books rather than novels. So I was just interested in that interchangeability and whether the responses say something about the book in general, the concept of the book. You know, I think it's Sarah in the chat as well referred to the importance of the materiality of the book during lockdown. Obviously, Dan has referred to book clubs and so on. And at a time when, you know, to be blunt, the arts and humanities are getting hammered, is there something about that concept of the book, the interchangeability between novel and book, which might be important to us?
I feel that I should have an answer, Ben, but I have.
You're the book historian, so
I know. I mean, one thing that we really discovered early on, I think, that was interesting in this sort of book historical perspective, is that the kinds of data that we rely on as book historians in the present to think about book circulation and book sales just weren't going to cut it in this case, because so much of the reading involved people reading stuff that they had on their shelves, or in some cases even stuff that they, you know, had found picked up in their neighbors recycling and were reading. People became sort of resourceful about getting and using books. I guess resourcefulness might be a topic generally. You know, we also have heard of people, you know, digging out that old ice cream maker that you thought you were never going to use, and doing all kinds of things with stuff that's just lying around. I mean, consumption has obviously not been the primary indicator of what people are up to. So that's interesting from a book historical point of view, because it means that the data we have about book sales and loans in our experience isn't going to tell us what people are really up to, or were really up to, at least in the first stage of the lockdown last year, because people really did seem to turn to their own bookshelves in this, or their friends' bookshelves, or so that is an interesting comment, I think, on the materiality of books as things that lie around with this kind of, you know, persistence and relevance, that books have a special status as objects that aren't just detritus in our lives. They had this kind of moment of suddenly coming into focus as objects that we could use. So it did have to do with their materiality and their special materiality, I think, as things that we keep and we treasure and we display, but we don't necessarily read until we have the opportunity to handle them in that way. But I mean, that doesn't speak to the sort of nice editions question of Sarah, or the particularity of the book as opposed to the audio book. But I think
there's,
yeah.
I think,
do you want to, sorry, Ben, do you want to speak to your question, Sarah, or?
Oh, hi. Yeah, no, I am here. I was doing a million things, so I didn't think I would turn myself on. It was just that early in lockdown, I found certain books, particularly from childhood, kind of returning to me, certain things that I wanted to read. This is a good example, which I just picked off my shelf, which is Marianne Dreams by Catherine Storr. And it's a book that really seemed to speak to our early experiences of lockdown, because it's about someone who is in a room, she's in bed, she's ill, she can't leave that room, and then she dreams of this house, which is itself very enclosed, and there's a whole kind of story around that. But one of the things I enjoyed so much about rereading this, you know, it's partly kind of childhood comfort and nostalgia, but the fact that it's this kind of worn edition, and I think everything in those very early days of lockdown one were very heightened. We were all under a lot of stress, and something about the kind of materiality of this book really spoke to me in those days. I just wondered if other people had picked that up, because there was a lot of talk about reading, consumption, or whether people couldn't read, but I didn't see so much about the material text.
Yeah, that came across quite a lot in terms of, in a couple of ways. One, as you said, sort of returning to a favorite edition, particularly for childhood is a key element here, returning to the edition you may have read in childhood, or a marked copy, or sharing copies. Just the flip side was that at the beginning of lockdown, people ordering books were scared of the materiality. And remember, there was that sort of 48-hour time period when you got your Amazon or independent bookshop delivery and had to put it in a bucket or wait for it. So, and I know Leah Price is working on that sort of angle, the history of contagion and the materiality. So it worked both ways. And the other thing I'd say is that one of the things that comes across is most strongly from all the interviews is the importance of libraries.
Yeah.
The amount of people who were distraught basically when their library closed and they couldn't get physical books. And particularly for people who weren't familiar with digital books, or, you know, particularly people isolated on their own, the sort of that, I think in terms of caring for the discipline, caring for libraries is central as well, particularly about, and as you said, it's about materiality, it's also about experience, and it's about community, the library. So I think that came across sort of profoundly, actually.
Yeah, and the other thing, Sarah, in your anecdote just now about that book is that is also for us like very typical of stuff we've heard, is this idea of this story that suddenly spoke to you as relevant to your own situation. That's an extraordinary sort of moment, but it's not extraordinary amongst the stories that we've heard. A lot of people have told us exactly that. Oh, I didn't know that this story was actually about exactly what I was going through. So this idea that something that you didn't actually think was related referentially to your own experience turns out to be, this is obviously a very beautiful thing in a way. It's just this sort of funny idea that these stories get looped back into our own experience as we read them and pick them up with this different angle, and just evidence for us that, you know, what we read, what we think a story's about is so often sort of connected in some way to the situation that we're reading it in.
Yeah, absolutely. I see someone in the chat has mentioned The Secret Garden, which I didn't reread, but thought a lot about, because it's also a book of quarantine and contagion, which is not an aspect that I'd remembered, except when I thought back and thought about the cholera.
Yeah, and we had Little Women, people talking about Little Women being like that kind of, a novel in that sense, and you wouldn't normally think about it like that either. Yeah.
Folks, it's nearly 10:40. So Catherine Storr, yeah, amazing writer. So I'm going to draw this to a close. Like a really good seminar, as we've been discovering this last year, there's a vocal conversation and also an amazing conversation going on in the chat at the same time. So that's really fantastic and interesting. I would really like to thank Tina and Ben in two ways. I would like to thank them first for coming to speak with us today, and I would also like to thank them for a really astonishingly interesting caring for the discipline project that I'm certain will have all sorts of amazing consequences and ramifications for us. So thank you very much indeed. That was really fantastic. Really appreciate it. So I'm clapping by myself seems really weird still. We will be back, everybody, in 20 minutes at 11 o'clock. And again, thank you again.
Thanks.
Futures kind of keep the show on the road, particularly over this kind of dreadful year. So I'll just introduce myself. My name is Alex Thompson, and I'm head of English and Scottish literature at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm also chair of University English, which is a body which represents English departments in UK higher education. And in that role, I'm only too aware both of the significance of the very many subject associations and learned societies who form a critical part of the ecology of the discipline and kind of care for the discipline, care for English in that sense, and certainly of the humanities more widely. And I'm also, I think, very aware of the challenges that we've all faced kind of within our institutions and within our organisations over the last 12 months. I thought it's worth just saying at the start that there's a great variety of different types of organisation and different types of learning societies and subject bodies, and they'll all have very different perspectives on you know, how the last year has gone. Some, for example, manage large buildings or have relatively large staff that they've had to furlough or deal with. Others are simply a network of volunteers, and of course that comes under massive pressure when our time is distorted in the way that Tina and Ben were so helpfully kind of flagging to us last year. Some have individual members, some are associated with institutions, some have publishing programs, others do not. So it's very hard to generalize. And for that reason, and to reflect that range, we've invited representatives from quite a wide range of bodies to discuss how their organization has adapted to kind of working conditions over the last 12 months and how they might look forward in light of that. So we invited everybody to speak for about 5 minutes about their experiences and how this might impact the plans of their organization going forward. I'm so saturated in management speak that it just comes naturally to me. So I'm apologizing to Ben in particular, who I think flagged moving forward as a phrase he hates. So sorry, everybody. And after everyone has spoken, then hopefully there's going to be some time for questions and discussions. And certainly one of the things that I found over the last year is that learning from what other organizations are doing has been tremendously helpful. So I'm really looking forward to this. The other thing I was just going to say, there's two things to say. One is that the world of learned societies is a world of acronyms. And I want to just flag up that in order, we will have speakers from the BAAS, BACLS, BAIS, BAVS, EAIALS. And then we hoped to have Anshu Mondal from the Postcolonial Studies Association speaking as well. But he's asked me to pass on his apologies. He had his first shot of vaccine yesterday and is completely floored by it. So he is really sorry that he can't join us here today, but I think we recognize that that's in a good cause, that he's taken that in the line of duty. So I'm going to introduce everybody when they speak. We've got a large range of speakers. I thought it'd be asking too much of you on a Friday to remember 6 names and affiliations all the way through. And I'm going to introduce, or we're going to speak in the order of our organizations by acronym. So that means that we start with Dr. Cara Rodway, who is Assistant Head of the Eccles Centre for American Studies and is also Chair of the British Association of American Studies. So brilliant. Over to you, Cara.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's really lovely to be here. I'm really pleased that we're able to have this conversation. I second Alex's point about, the benefit of learning from our colleagues. So I represent BAS, the British Association for American Studies. We're an interdisciplinary, primarily volunteer-run organisation. We have about 650 members and an executive committee that's made up of volunteers. We do have a publishing arm, just for those who are interested. We publish the Journal of American Studies with the University of Cambridge, which is, bluntly speaking, where the majority of our income comes from. That's what keeps us going. We're very fortunate. We do quite well with it. But what I was really just going to touch on for a few minutes, and I will try and time myself and be good because I know there's a lot of us speaking, was really, I think, just to reflect on the last year for us, I think, which has really been about trying to find the silver linings. I don't know if this will echo for others, but environmental sustainability, inclusion and access have really been kind of major organisational priorities for us in recent times of pre-pandemic, and we were moving towards using more sort of digital technology to assist with, for example, the administration of the association, so committee meetings. We did have a Zoom account before they were all the rage, which I feel is like a super badge of honour. So we were trying to do, as I say, sort of remote committee meetings, particularly saving us money, but also, because of the environmental impact of all the travel that's required to kind of bring people together 4 times a year or whatever. And we'd also been planning to hold a fully remote conference as part of our mission to kind of green the organisation. But in the pandemic, we had to cancel our April 2020 conference. So I'd like to give a big shout out to David Herring at the University of Liverpool, who had organised the whole thing, and then we just couldn't deliver it, which was very sad. But we repurposed quite a number of the papers and panels, and particularly the networking sessions, into what we call the Digital Dialogues event series in June and July last year, which was a really good experiment, I think, in terms of kind of planning and organisation, and also, was really part of that sort of silver lining that everyone is having to upskill in the digital space and kind of feel more comfortable with these kinds of kind of research and sort of personal interactions. And so another kind of key activity that we've been doing as an organisation in the last few years has been developing sub-networks. So we have a women's network, a teaching network, a BIPOC Americanist network, and now the newest is a Green BAS network for sort of Americanist environmental humanities. And the digital space has been really good for these kinds of discussions. They're kind of liberating them from that once a year, you know, you meet one lunchtime during the annual conference, you know, giving the opportunity for many more regular meetings, you know, I think that's been really helpful. And there's been real value, I think, for colleagues in connecting with people, you know, outside of your institution. Obviously, a lot of Americanists can be sort of lone individuals in a department. So, you know, connecting with others working in the area has been really helpful. But it's also for example, our postgraduate network has been moving to do more work in progress sessions, which have been very well received by the community. And so those kinds of more regular and perhaps more nuanced interactions have been a really positive outcome. And so, as I say, building on all this experience, we decided to run a fully digital conference for our annual conference this year. We kind of made that commitment last summer, thinking, you know, it removed a lot of uncertainty and it allowed us to test these things that we'd been interested in. So, but it required new models, and that's one thing I think that's been quite interesting. So, you know, normally our conference model has been an individual organizer at a university, often supported by sort of conferencing and admin colleagues, you know, putting on the whole show. And so what we did is that, because obviously the financial model of the conference had changed, there weren't the sort of expenditures on, frankly, rooms and sandwiches, you know, we decided to pay a decent wage to a conference manager to come and run it for us, somebody with a digital experience. And that meant that obviously we weren't putting too much burden, hopefully, on the volunteers who lead the organisation. And it was great. It brought in new expertise, and it was a really good model. I think we were really pleased with how it all turned out. And the conference enabled us to sort of experiment in terms of things like timing, working across time zones, and also making things available asynchronously. And that was, I think, really an important, as part of our sort of interest in improving inclusivity and access, you know, for people, obviously, particularly in the midst of a lockdown where people are often at home with families, you know, caring commitments, but also, you know, bearing in mind that one of the good things of this digital turn is, you know, people for whom the commitment of time or, you know, financial resource to attend a traditional sort of 3-day conference would just be, you know, is too much, that this did enable different types of participation. And there was a real impressive expansion, frankly, in terms of geographical engagement. You know, we had colleagues from India, we had colleagues from the Middle East, we had colleagues from Asia. It was, you know, it was Cyprus, I think it's technically Asia. You know, so that was really, it was something that we were really happy about. And also there were interesting changes. You know, the digital space requires kind of structured networking. As we all know, if you sit there in this meeting with lots and lots of people, you know, you need someone to be leading things, you need to be breaking into smaller groups. And I think that did sort of help break down some of those perhaps bad habits of in-person conferencing. But there was definitely a feeling amongst you know, perhaps existing members who know what it's like to go to kind of regular in-person conferences, that they really did miss some of the more kind of perhaps off-the-cuff opportunities to interact with friends and to meet new people. And also, I think we really, I'm sure this is something that everyone's thought about, have to really remain sensitive to what is this experience particularly like for junior colleagues. You know, if you're new into the field, into the discipline as an academic, you know, how do you make those new relationships, be they, you know, professional or personal? You know, and so what do we need to kind of retain? What's the good stuff of the old that we need to keep, and what's the good stuff of the digital that we want to kind of hold going forwards? I've realized I'm over 5 minutes. I'm so sorry. I just want to flag one other thing we did was we retooled our awards program. So rather than encouraging research travel, it's now research assistance, to try and get people to think about kind of other ways of using research assistance rather than traveling. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to run over, but there's lots to talk about and I'm really excited to hear from everyone else. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cara. And it's wonderful to hear all of the opportunities, all the possibilities that have opened up. And I'm actually thinking, oh, I wonder if you have time to help us explore some of those and learn from your experience. So our second speaker is Professor Katie Shaw, who is Professor of Contemporary Writings at Northumbria University, and is here in her capacity as Vice Chair of the British Association for Contemporary Literary Studies.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everybody, virtually. It's lovely to see you all here today supporting ESF, and it's lovely to speak very quickly on behalf of BACLS. BACLS, as an acronym, is the British Association of Contemporary Literary Studies. We were formed in 2017, and we're a scholarly organisation that brings together both academics and practitioners from across the UK and beyond to try and think about the current moment and its contexts. So at the start of the pandemic, we thought we were quite well placed because we were a very digital savvy organisation. We had 2 journals that were both online, open access, no print. And we were also, like Cara, doing our AGMs and our interim meetings on Zoom. And this was mainly due to cost of travel and environmental reasons, but also the geographic diversity of our exec. Speaking for myself, as I am here in Newcastle, getting to London and back for a 2-hour meeting was just bonkers and impossible. So we were already quite Zoomy, quite tech savvy, had social media accounts. So we thought we were quite well positioned, but actually what kind of amassed over the next few months showed us that we did need to pivot quite quickly. So what we did really was start off by thinking about our principles as an organisation and how we keep them alive and build on them during the pandemic year. The idea really behind our pivot was that we wanted our Learned Society to be a place where members could continue to share ideas and share research when other external in-person opportunities were drying up. And we also needed that forum where people could share their thoughts and their fears and their hopes and network with one another at a time at which any kind of interaction and opportunities for that had been closed down. So we set about a series of changes that were founded on principles of communication, the value of listening to our members, and also of tracking trends across the sector to see what was working and what wasn't. So this really for us meant investing in lots of different things. So we don't have any income from journals. Obviously, all our journals are free, open access. So we had to think about how we use membership fees in perhaps more innovative ways. And the first thing we did was membership waiver. So anybody who is experiencing any kind of financial hardship, we instigated membership waivers on fees, and that is continued into this year in terms of responding to members' COVID hardship. We also redirected funds that may well have gone on cheap sandwiches at conferences, cheap in terms of quality rather than price tag, to the website. So we really invested heavily and worked hard on the website in terms of thinking about how we could develop the new members area. So we invested in things like help sheets, teaching resources, opportunities networks for jobs and work experience, briefings on anti-casualisation, and also things like research bidding and ref. In addition to this, we invested time and money in our social media presence, so developing our Twitter feed and also a new newsletter, which we emailed out to members to help stay in touch, both us with them and then with each other during lockdown. We invested in the journals, so C21 and both Alluvium. We kept publishing what research articles we were receiving during lockdown and also book reviews. This was really important, we felt, so that people actually had a platform where they could get work out quite quickly when lots of other journals seemed to be kind of grinding to a halt. We also instigated a new seminar series that was entirely online. Now, this seminar series was quite important because it wasn't just people presenting on a bit of research they were doing, it was actually responding to pandemic challenges. So we had sessions on things like pandemic pedagogy, how you teach in the online classroom, what our members' experiences were, what their questions were, and things like also EDI, because there was real fears, and there are still fears, that EDI will get kicked to a curb as like a nicety in the wake of the pandemic. So we've had quite open platforms about those, and they're really important because they're safe spaces in which members can ask questions that they might not always feel comfortable asking with colleagues in their institutions or with management. Like other learned societies, we've pivoted our conference funds, our events endorsement to try and support more online events to nurture the subject community. And we've also shifted our 2021 conference this September, call for papers out now, online to try and enable a diversity of speakers, but also again, to make sure our members are safe this year. We've also carried on our own research into the role of BACLs globally. So we produced a report with the British Council. It was published last month based on a big original data set, thinking about where 21st century British literature is being taught globally. So that research has generated a series of hotspots for us that we're going to explore with the British Council, working with publishers and with other HEIs to think about how BACLs can reach out and pool resources and try and enable global networks post-pandemic. And looking forward very quickly in the 5 minutes, to the role of learned societies post-pandemic, we really believe that all of us have a responsibility to support our members and to promote our disciplinary fields during a period in which the discipline itself is going to be and continue to be heavily questioned in terms of its value and relevance. We need to facilitate new opportunities for postgraduate researchers and staff of all levels that have onboarded to organisations during the pandemic or that are seeking work. And more specifically for us as a contemporary literature organisation, our focus is going to very much be on thinking about the role of literature in society and the responsibility of literary text to address COVID and its fallout and future contemporary events. And that will ultimately mean that our organisation is shaped by the aftermath of COVID for a very long time to come.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Katie. And there'll be opportunities to ask questions about all of these initiatives at the end of the session. So if people want to put any early questions into the chat while people's talks are fresh in your mind, I'd encourage you to do so. Thanks, everyone. Our third speaker will be Dr. Caroline McGuinness, who is reader in 20th and 21st century literature at the University of Salford and is here today in her role as chair of the British Association of Irish Studies.
Thank you very much, Alex. The remit of the British Association of Irish Studies might be a little different than some of the other scholarly associations that we've heard from today. Our members are from a really broad array of disciplines, where literature and history feature quite predominantly. We also have linguists working on the Irish language. We have geographers. So we're right across the sort of the humanities and social scientists. And we also have quite a few community members as well. So people from the Irish diaspora who are really interested in Irish literature and culture, but mightn't necessarily be attached to an academic department. There's a remit in our constitution that is to sort of, I don't want to sound like to educate the British, but that's essentially what it is, on Irish sort of culture and history and society and things like that. So that's some of the imperatives that we wanted to keep going into this new changed reality. We also have a lot of members who are Irish and have been in this country for more than a year and are very homesick, and even just hearing a voice and talking about the culture, I know, has been very important to them as sort of a real tonic during the pandemic as well. The word I'd use to describe our offering has been organic. We didn't really have a design of what we were going to do, and I think for all of us, we didn't know what was going on with the pandemic month by month, week by week. So we've all just really been rolling with the punches and doing our best. We sort of developed informally some broad principles. First of all, everything would be asynchronous to allow parents and carers in the geographic remit. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that everything would be free and everything would be available to anyone, regardless of whether they were a member or not. We didn't think a pandemic was the time and place to be precious about our membership income. The second is that we wanted something that was as sort of non-hierarchical as possible to allow early career scholars the ability to present as well. The other thing was that we really wanted to care for ourselves as an executive as well. We didn't want the equivalent of, you know, the family that buys the dog and the mommy's always looking after the dog. We wanted to make sure that if anyone suggested anything, they had the time and the space and the capacity to do it. So they were the most important things for us. So over the course of the year, we developed some events. Myself and the secretary, Maggie Scull, hatched a bit of a plan on the back of an envelope, but it's really evolved over the course of the year. We have two early career researchers, Lloyd Maeve Houston and Vicky Brown, who do amazing work on sort of helping our events. But we're all doing our best, so we didn't want to overcommit ourselves with the first thing. Sophie Cooper and Erin Shupner are two early career researchers who just put together a month-long sort of series of events, and I'll talk about that in a second with the time I have. So what we did, our achievable plan was, first of all, Zoom seminars. We had a session on Brexit and Irish passports. We had something on racism and Irish cultural life, and something on the mother and baby homes, because that felt like something our members really urgently wanted to talk about. I hosted, for some bizarre reason, a 7-book launch at Christmas, where we all had our little mulled wine and celebrated our community with all those books that weren't launched that year. We had a digital prize giving, and we are funded by the Government of Ireland to award postgraduate bursaries. We've made it clear that those bursaries could be taken for travel or conference, and it's right through into 2022 as well, so hopefully that helped them. We started a digital research day where everyone just posts resources that the community might find useful on St. Patrick's Day every year, which has worked really well. But the thing that has, I think, worked the best for us has been our digital conference. And it probably isn't like any of the other digital conferences I've heard of. It's a month long. It's drop in, drop out, do what you like, do what you feel whenever you're ready for it. It all happens on Twitter. There's no schedule, there's no time limit, there's no change to what method you can use. It's completely anarchic. If you are a PhD student and you want to give like a keynote level conference paper, absolutely fine. We had someone last year talked about, colonialism using TikTok. Like, we're just whatever goes, and we have no idea. We got nearly 40 papers last year. Everything had really good engagement. My PhD student gave her first conference paper on Dairy Girls, which was viewed more times than papers by more established academics. So I do really like the vibe of it all. So you can find all that information on our social media. It starts tomorrow. I have no idea what we're going to get. I'll give a paper. Maybe some of you might give a paper. I genuinely no idea what's going to happen, and I'm really excited by that. So I think at a time when it's really more vital than ever to widen the understanding of sort of British and Irish relations, especially a lot of what's been going on, and especially in the last week. Hopefully we've been a small contribution to that. Things that have been organic, spontaneous and member-led has really been what we've been about this last year. And I have no idea what we're going to do for the rest of the year, but I'm sure it'll be interesting anyway. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carolyn. I am so excited by the idea of this kind of anarchic, free-flowing conference, and I'm going to go and definitely look into that. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Dinah Birch, who is Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Impact and Professor of English Literature at the University of Liverpool, and is speaking today as President of the British Association of Victorian Studies.
Thanks, Alex. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning. BAVS is an interdisciplinary association. It's now 21 years old, founded in 2000, so we consider ourselves to have come of age. The membership is drawn from historians, English specialists, art historians, musicologists, historians of science, cultural historians, and there's a lot of interdisciplinary research and activity going on among our members. We do have a high proportion of early career researchers among our membership. And by that, I don't just mean young lecturers or postdocs. We have a great many doctoral students too. We are very proud of the work that we have developed over the last 20 years in supporting their careers. So, like other subject associations, we have been challenged, sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in ways that have been more disconcerting throughout the pandemic. So I would echo many of the points that other representatives of subject associations have made, and I won't repeat them. We have felt, perhaps particularly keenly, the loss of our in-person events. We have run an annual conference for many years. Indeed, many people on this call have attended that conference, and that has been hugely important to our profile, to our work, and the support that we've been able to give our members. And here I go back to that earlier point about our high proportion of young researchers. I do want to underline an aspect of that loss, which I do think is important, alongside all the benefits of online communication and online events. there are some serious kind of losses. If you're starting out or hoping to launch an academic career, that opportunity to meet people in person, face to face, to talk to them informally over coffee, in the lunch queue, and perhaps especially in the bar. We know, perhaps from our own experiences, but certainly from what people have told us, is just so formative for young people. Having that feedback, having that sense of a direct personal connection with those who are established in the academic profession. It's very, very hard to replicate that network online. We obviously are doing our best to do so, but it isn't easy. So we will have a hybrid event, not this summer, but in 2022 as an annual conference, which we will be holding in Birmingham, which is a great place for Victorianist conference. Meanwhile, again, like other associations, we've been running online events. We have a program which we're calling BAVs at Home. And it has been very successful, and it has brought together people who perhaps wouldn't have been able to attend in-person events. But we are concerned about what can't be achieved in those events. That's a point that we might return to. Just 3 final points very quickly to end with. Firstly, we've established a program of hardship grants, which we are funding not through subscriptions or through other forms of income, but really through crowdsourcing and voluntary donations. We've been able to acquire enough funding to make that worthwhile. They're not huge grants, they're £400, but they have been, I think, hugely positive for their recipients. The applications that we've had, more applicants than we've been able to fund, so we are continuing this as a rolling programme, have been deeply moving, in fact. I mean, sometimes really heartbreaking. And I think as much as the practical help that's provided by those grants, the psychological and emotional support, just from knowing that we're there and that we do know about the crises, financial crises that many of our members are contending with, and that we are trying to help. I think that support has meant as much to people as the £400 grants that we've been able to hand out. We will try to continue that programme as far as we can. Secondly, we've established a new book prize because we do think that the book form, perhaps going back to our earlier discussion this morning, isn't entirely secure within an academic context. Monographs, I think, are irreplaceable in our shared intellectual lives. So we thought it important to do that, and this is its first year. And finally, a point perhaps to underline what other people have been saying. There is a cold wind beginning to blow across humanities, arts and humanities, not just this discipline, but we're all working in an interdisciplinary framework. We just from the point of view of academic finances, and we are predominantly academics in this Zoom room. We're currently in something of a phony war, but we are still able to sustain, as universities, most of our previous activities. They will be real challenges for humanities departments, arts and humanities departments over the next 2 or 3 years. And it is really important that we hang together and that we work together to sustain the research, the teaching that we do, and to make it explicit to our university leadership bodies and to external stakeholders that work really matters, as we know, but not everyone does, and that the public benefit it confers really matters. It's one of the reasons, of course, why REF is so important. But so too is the work of subject associations. And the final point that I would want to make is that we need to work together on this. We're all in the same little boat, and it's going to be a boat that will be rocked by some quite choppy seas. So we should acknowledge between ourselves that it is going to be difficult and that we can make a difference. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dinah. And I'm sure those points were resonating with very many of us as we listened at the end there. So it gives me great pleasure to be able to turn to our host today and to ask Dr. Becky Fisher, who is Chief Executive of the English Association, to talk us through their experiences this year.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So I've just shared my screen with you because I'm an expert procrastinator amongst, more than anything. So I just love faffing around with slides. So I've got some of those to share with you. So the English Association, we are the learned society for English studies. So that's language, linguistics, literature and creative writing from early years through primary, secondary, further education, higher education and beyond. Our mission is primarily to support, promote and defend the discipline of English studies. And that means we have a really wide remit. So I can't talk about everything we've done throughout the pandemic today. So what I want to focus on is the things that we've done to try and support our members. And the reason for that is that without our members, we wouldn't exist, both practically because we rely on membership fee income, but also because it's the people who make the English Association what it is and that do the important work. And every example I share with you today has been made possible by the brilliant people who make up the English Association. So when the pandemic hit, what we really wanted to focus on was thinking about community, sharing stories and experiences and helping members combat feelings of loneliness and isolation. So this first slide is one of the very first projects that we did, English in Education during COVID-19, where we invited people to basically just share their stories with us about how they were finding their lives in teaching and learning and in general during the pandemic. And in fact, there are people in the room with us today who have supplied some of their stories. So thank you again to those people for being so generous with their time and their experiences. So we did these stories and that kind of led us into a couple of other projects. So we have a series of publications called Issues in English, which are occasional. So we tend to have 2, 3, 4 a year, and they explore some kind of current challenge or conversation. So the two on your screen right now, one of them, again, was edited and written by people who are in the room with us today in the midst of things COVID-19 and English. And the second, Rainbows in Our Windows, Childhood in the Time of Corona, was suggested to us by colleagues from the University of Warwick who were having a conference on just this topic. It's interdisciplinary and brings together scholars from all over the world to talk about how the pandemic has impacted on children and their studies. We made issue 14 free to all of our members. So if you are a member and you didn't get one, let me know and I'll pop it over to you. And the other one for our members is just £2. So we looked at experiences of our colleagues in these publications. And we also did a survey amongst our fellows to ask them about their experiences in higher education during COVID and the impact on their research and teaching. And we'll follow that up with a second round of questions to see how things have changed later on this summer to give us a sense of how things are going. We also wanted to share stories from our colleagues in primary, secondary and further education. So we had 3 special issues of our newsletter come round to all of our members, literature and lockdown in secondary education, lessons from lockdown, which focused on primary and early years education, and this year's spring newsletter, which is post-16 English during the pandemic and beyond. And mine actually just came through the postbox this morning, so keep an eye out for it if yours hasn't arrived. So the idea of these, again, was to just keep bringing people's stories together and give us that sense of community and togetherness that we aren't getting from being physically together at the moment. We also ran a couple of online member networking events themed around have young people gone off English and further Englishes in higher education. And again, the people who ran these events for us are in the room. Just another great example of how our members make the English Association happen. Like everyone, we've seen online events just becoming more and more important. So we'll continue to do more of these. And we also pivoted our AGM and awards ceremony online and tried to really beef those events up into something really celebratory and joyful, so that it would be a high point of the year for our members to have something to look forward to. The last thing I'm going to mention, obviously you can't not mention English Shared Futures, which of course is a collaboration between the English Association and our friends and colleagues. So English Shared Futures 2020 went online and was really enjoyable, a great success with fantastic speakers and conversations. And since then, we've continued to have new drops of exciting content each month, which has been made possible by a fantastic Ellie Beale. So thank you to Ellie. I know she's here today, so I'll embarrass her by mentioning her. And hopefully English Shared Futures, as we've seen today, is a real sort of nexus point for people to come together. So just quickly looking ahead to what we want to continue doing as the pandemic is still with us. We want to do more networking, more peer support opportunities, more ways for members to come together and collaborate and support each other. And it's important to say as well that our education committees are extremely active at the moment, taking part in national and discipline level conversations about our discipline. And I just haven't had time to talk about those today, but very happy to talk more about those later if you would like. And I'm going to stop there, but very happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Becky. And again, as with all the presentations, lots to discuss that we could dig into. We have one more and then I will be able to unleash people's questions on the panel. So finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jeremy Scott, who is Senior Lecturer in English Language and Literature at the University of Kent and is President of the International Association of Literary Semantics. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? Yep.
Absolutely.
So, oh yeah, President of the International Association of Literary Semantics. I should mention my colleague Chloe Harrison is also here. She's our treasurer. So if I misspeak at any point, Chloe, please do correct me. IALS, the International Association of Literary Semantics, is what's really great about it. No one really knows what that means, which is quite amusing and allows us to evolve in very interesting and innovative ways. It was founded in 1990 at the University of Kent and also has a journal, the Journal of Literary Semantics. Edited by Marina Lambrou. And our remit really is to work in an interdisciplinary way at the border between language and literary studies. And to put it as generally as possible, we're interested in the bases of literary meaning, if that doesn't sound too amorphous, but how texts come to mean. So we have a very interdisciplinary flavour, literary scholars, creative writers, linguists, and also cognitive psychology and philosophy and things like that come into it too. We're also inherently and explicitly international and European. We have a lot of members and colleagues, particularly in eastern parts of Europe, who are very involved with the association. Unlike some of my colleagues, we were not and have not been digi ready. And I think we've learned a lot. And I think now we're better at that. So what I'm going to be talking about is really how we've caught up with what some of my colleagues already seem to be doing so well by the sound of it. We have a conference biannually. We were planning on going to Vilnius, the University of Lithuania, Vilnius in Lithuania. And we had to postpone that obviously due to COVID. We're hoping to run it face-to-face in October. And I'll post details about it in the chat when I finish. But Whether we manage to do that or not is still up for grabs, given the constantly evolving circumstances that we're all in. But we're hoping to be able to run it then. If not, we'll go online. But I do feel, and I echo what Dinah has said and some people in the chat, that we miss a lot by not having these face-to-face interactions. I like the affordances of this digital environment. I'm very grateful for the opportunities it's afforded us, and also would agree with my colleagues' comments about the environmental impact of travel, etc. These are all important things. But I do think we miss that face-to-face interaction as well as the social life around it, and particularly, as already been mentioned, early career scholars benefit greatly from that kind of thing, and it simply isn't doable in the same way online. I feel quite strongly about that, and I know that the members of the committee agree, but I'd be interested to hear if anyone disagrees. But what we've done is we've revamped our website and relaunched it, so it's much more alive, if you put it like that. We have a members area now which you can log into. We'll be using that also to launch a series of podcasts, building on this idea of asynchronous interaction, which I think is also very useful given time zones, the international nature of the work that we do, and so on. So we're going to be launching those at our conference in October. Our committee meetings have been online through Zoom, and that seems to have worked perfectly well, rather than schlepping into London, which is what we were doing before. We've also moved to the idea of an online postgraduate work in progress session, because we feel that's a very important thing to develop with an eye on the future of the discipline. So I'd say that online has opened up a lot of opportunities for us, and now we have a much better digital presence. We have a very active Twitter account, for example, and those have all been really useful things. But I just want to re-emphasize, I think, the importance of face-to-face interaction, which is why we're still clinging on to the hope that we'll be able to meet properly in October. And finally, I just wanted to again endorse something that Dinah said, and I agree very much with. I think the role of scholarly associations is really important in being more outward facing and promoting our discipline. And I think events like this, I'm so grateful to have been invited, because I think this is an ideal opportunity for us to really put our heads together and think about how we create a public facing image of what we do that will justify, should it need justifying, which apparently it does, the importance of the humanities at the centre of our cultural and intellectual life. And I think we do have a role to play that we haven't played as well as we could do so far, in my opinion. So I'd really endorse that, and would be very open to more explicit cooperation across our discipline between the different societies. And I think Shared Futures, for example, is a great example of how we can continue to do that. But I'll post details of our association, so anybody who is interested in literary meaning and this intersection between language and linguistics and literary studies would be very happy to hear from you, and see you at one of our events in the near future. And thanks again for this opportunity to come and speak. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And yeah, you kind of preempted me, because I was about to kind of give English Shared Futures a kind of big plug here, because I think a lot of the initial instinct behind it was that kind of cross-fertilization and cooperation between different organizations within the disciplinary space could be a kind of huge boost. And I think that, I think that's the case, and I think we have a really strong platform to build on as a group.
It's essential, isn't it? It's imperative that we do this, really.
Absolutely. So could I perhaps invite all the panel to unmask yourselves and ask and get ready to take questions. I think the two themes that are coming up most in we've had more sort of observations, I think, than comments in the than specific questions in the chat. I think the two things that are coming through loud and clearly, where maybe we could invite sort of a panelist to offer views on how we push on these. So one is, how do we replicate, particularly for early career people entering our networks? How do we cross that make those barriers easy to cross? What is really effective for networking and bringing people in when we can't be at the kebab fan at 2 a.m. as Simon mentions? And of course, there are issues around accessibility and equality for that old model. So I don't think we're saying how do we replicate the past, but how do we kind of move forward? And I think the other thing that's coming through loud and clearly is the value of what we can do in terms of public outreach and engagement. And obviously that doesn't replace the kind of work that departments and universities need to be doing, and that departments need to be doing within universities to kind of really ensure that the value and the nature of what we do is well understood, because I think that's still not something that any of us can kind of rely on. So yeah, so I guess do any of the panelists want to kind of answer that? It's either what can we do in terms of public outreach, what works, what's going to be valuable, and how do we help those entering our networks and our organizations kind of cross those barriers when we don't have those physical meetings. Yeah, Cara, brilliant.
Thank you. It was just to think a little bit about conferencing, because I do feel like I've spent a lot of time thinking about it this past year. But I think, you know, really one of the things that I've reflected on a lot is that, yes, there are a lot of things that we miss with the in-person. And, you know, I, as much as anybody, have enjoyed, you know, the going to the pub or, you know, but that's not appropriate for everybody, you know, and the more you talk to colleagues, the more, you know, for some people, it's just, it's expense, it's, you know, caring responsibilities, it's not feeling welcome, it's not wanting to drink, it's, you know, there's all these different things, you know, young women not feeling safe being out at night in a city they don't know, trying to get back to some random hotel. You know, there's so many issues, which I think it's very important, yeah, not to think that all the old models were always great, because they weren't. And I think one of the things that I've really reflected on with the digital space is the fact that it requires a bit more thought. You know, how do you make it work? You know, you can't just put everyone in a Zoom space like this and be like, okay, all 40 people have the floor, you know, what are we going to do? So I think, you know, doing things like, you know, breaking out into rooms, you know, doing sort of speed networking events where, you know, you're shuffling people, those kinds of things actually to me seem, you know, that's quite positive. But you know, I do recognize that then, you know, it's a bit sort of structured, and some people find that difficult, but I think, you know, that has struck me as quite positive. And I noticed somebody popped in the chat, you know, new programs, the Wonder program, which I've not had a chance to play with, but there's, you know, there are kind of new things out there. And then I think it's thinking specifically about, you know, well, how can we create new types of interaction to try and replicate? So whether that's kind of, you know, I loved this, you know, Caroline's ideas about, you know, online, you know, the Twitter, you know, so we have a hashtag #WriteAmStudies event that happens once a week where PhD students, you know, talk about what they're doing, and it's a way to sort of focus a day for writing. And I know that's been very well received. You know, maybe it's running sort of different types, almost like summer schools, different sort of activities which we can to try and kind of create those relationships. So I'll be quiet because I can see a plethora of hands popping up, so I'm sure everyone has even more insight. So thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm going to just take the people in the order that their hands came up. So that was Caroline next.
Very much. I would agree with a lot of what Cara said, especially, although, you know, speaking as someone who quite likes the pub, I appreciate that a lot of the sort of spaces that we have that we've had to socialize in aren't necessarily appropriate for everyone, and this might give us a chance to reflect on making sure that our community feel safe. Regarding the early career researchers, what we have found is that initiatives work best when they come from early career researchers and not from us, who are quite distant from what they actually want and need. So my PhD student has never been to a conference. She has never met anyone in the field. She just she was about to go to a conference, and then all of this hit. So there is in Belfast, there's an early career researcher called Alison Garden who regularly runs writing workshops and writing retreats on an informal basis. So we decided to bring her in to base to run writing retreats and writing days where postgrads sort of check in with each other at various different points during the day. And we've also organised our Zoom networking sessions so that it's in sort of like thematic grouping. So I basically asked our researchers, like, what do you need and what do you want to do? And they came up, we want to meet our peers and discuss our work. And we want to have places to do those sort of more small scale interactions. I think social media is fine in certain ways, but I think the most critical moment isn't necessarily even us socializing with our friends in the field, which is amazing and great. It's those first interactions where people meet those researchers who will still be their collaborators, you know, even when they're sort of into mid-career.
Brilliant, thanks, Caroline. That's really helpful. Dinah's next.
Thanks. So just one additional point to the conversation we're having about young researchers. I do worry about the professional future of many of our younger researchers. And I suppose I'm thinking primarily, but not exclusively, of our doctoral students. And I hope what I'm going to say doesn't sound in any way defeatist or dispiriting, but the hard fact of the matter is quite a high proportion of doctoral students embarking on high-level studies in humanities are not going to get high-quality, permanent academic jobs. It's not going to happen, and we can already see that movement of withdrawal from those jobs underway. It was happening, frankly, before the pandemic hit. So I think one priority for us in considering, as I think we really must, career development and employment issues for younger researchers is to conceive of new ways of supporting those people through what will be for many, really difficult times. Thinking of, as it were, diversifying career aspirations in areas like academic aligned careers, alt-ac careers, or indeed careers that are not associated in any way with the academic world. And that we really do need to feel that people who are not going to find their way into the kinds of jobs that we in this room, for the most part, we are the fortunate ones of the earth, do have, don't then feel that they are personal failures, that they have not made it, they have not been good enough, and that we care nothing for them and feel that they are second-rate folk. Because we all know we're supervisors and mentors in our own institutions and disciplines, that people who are often really good researchers would have been excellent academics, and they haven't got the breaks for all sorts of reasons not of their making. They can be very significantly damaged by that thought that they are failures, that they have not had the stamp of approval from the world that they wanted so much to enter. It can lead to years of bitterness. And I think that matters to us. It should matter to us that we reconceive in that respect our responsibilities to membership. I worry about this a lot. And I think there are things that we can do. We are, for instance, in Bath, so I'm sure we're not unique in this, reconfiguring the sort of careers advice and support that we are now starting to offer our younger members. So I'd be interested to hear of other ideas, experiences in other subject associations in this, in my view, really crucial area.
I completely agree, and I'm kind of going to bookmark this for everybody here as something which I think is such a big and important question that it's one that we all need to join together, because I think I can see how there is potentially a really incredibly valuable role for subject associations around a kind of research interests. I think that's a different role than the one, for example, that University English plays, and to some extent than the English Association plays, for creating these kind of vibrant communities that support research within and without the university, and essentially where in what you're rightly describing as what I think you said a cold wind, I think it's going to be a freezing cold wind, even for those of us in well-resourced institutions, that funds are not going to be available for the kinds of travel, for the kinds of research activity that we have become used to. How we support that, how we kind of keep this the incredible valuable the human resource, the people, the knowledge, the skills that we're kind of fostering. And I'm thinking also of people who've had maybe very prestigious postdocs who are unable to find works through luck. It is luck and time that makes, as we all know, that makes careers. That's a resource, and I think the support that we can potentially give for heads of department who have responsibilities to postdocs, to early career staff who are not going to find places, and genuine, I mean, I find it one of the hardest parts of my job is working with people who I think are exceptionally talented and brilliant, and for whom the current landscape is making things very difficult. So I think that that's such a big question, Dinah, that I think it's one that if we are going to kind of continue talking about these things, deserves to be the very focus of a discussion from the start. So Katie is next.
Yeah, just picking up on both points there, really. So I've got to scoot off from this directly to deliver a session to our PhD students on careers outside academia. And this is now a core part of delivery of training for all of our doctoral partnership students across subject areas. It's really important. It's something we don't talk about enough. And I think the failure paradox is absolutely correct. And it's something that we need to start thinking about and talking about for those of us who've also had careers outside of academia and still do have. How people are going to have portfolio careers in the future rather than just aligning themselves to being an academic forever. And to that end, Backles is really well positioned for this, because we don't just have academics as members, we have practitioners too, and publishers and people involved in the industry globally. So we're able to offer mentorship and networking to our members. So we're not just producing or trying to align our research interests solely towards academia and monographs and research bids. But this also relates to the second point, that wind, right? Now, what we all need to do is stop talking to each other and start talking to other people about why we matter, because we're assuming knowledge, both within the sector and externally, about our relevance and our contribution and our value economically, culturally, socially. We need to do some real work on this, and I think this is possibly a follow-on event for all learned societies and all subject associations, because one thing we're really bad at, I think, is articulating our value, and the pandemic has caused us to have to do that in a very sharp, focused way. And those of us who have written in 1KG or Times Higher about it, from VCs all the way down to early career lecturers in the subject area and broadly in the arts and humanities, have tried to tackle this, but actually we need to do more work as learned societies and as subject associations of having almost impact case studies on our websites and shouting quite loudly about our own contribution both to COVID and also to a post-COVID world. Because like EDI, like, we can't run the risk of being seen as a nicety or as an add-on or as something of the old ways. We have to appear and foreground how we are very relevant and very timely. And I think that we need to do that in a more coordinated way. And I think this needs as much resource as we're putting into web, as we're putting into ECR development and training, because unless we do this, there'll be no industry for our ECRs to progress into anyway.
Now, I'm struck, Katie, listening to you talk about the way that what you're describing about the movement inside and outside of the university, about careers inside and outside, is the way in which universities have themselves shifted over the last decade or even longer. And that it may be that there are cultures within some areas of the humanities or some departments, not all by any means, where that hasn't kind of sunk in. And of course, that's the world in which we have to demonstrate our value, not the way we might have imagined the humanities disciplines in the past, but it's also the way we defend our value inside and defend what we're doing outside. So I think that's a huge topic. So I've been told that we can have a few more minutes if we want to keep this kind of really important discussion going. I haven't seen any specific questions coming up in the chat to put to the panel, but I don't know if other panelists have any final reflections or suggestions or observations they want to throw in here. Yeah, Cara.
Sorry, I always do real hand. I'm terrible about remembering like the fake hand. So I just wanted to highlight really in the chat, I think those of us on the panel really feel the importance of talking to each other. I mean, I'm sure we all find, we all have members who cross into other societies or other sort of areas, and and they do bring in some really useful and interesting perspectives. But I definitely I feel as somebody very interested in how we run our learned society, and how we could be doing better and how we could be extending what we do. And also I'm really, really conscious, I know it's not the same for everyone, but being volunteer led, we're all doing this on top of other day jobs, which are related, we're fortunate, but I do feel sometimes like you know, we might be reinventing the wheel, and it would be very helpful to talk to colleagues, to have spaces to, you know, to say, you know, Katie made some great suggestions there about, you know, impact case studies, you know, but also I'm really interested in like schools outreach and, you know, work with, you know, with you know, different age groups, you know, and that's something where I just feel like, and I'm really thankful here to the English Association, I guess, for having given us this opportunity, but I think there would definitely be appetite for doing some more of this and sort of, you know, other good examples from within the community.
Thanks, Cara. I can see that Bob has his hand up.
Yeah, I'll just say something very quickly about the public facing stuff, which is absolutely 100% right. But then there's also a kind of complex organizational difficulty. So it's not just being able to articulate stuff, it's also having the networks and contacts of people, as it were, outside the ivory towers to whom to articulate it, with who will be sympathetic to us. And one thing we're very bad at, for kind of understandable reasons, is the sharing and using a wide range of kind of contacts in the media and government and local government and the civil service. And that's one of the things that we don't share them because of pressures, siloing pressures from the universities. We don't share them because they're kind of our contacts, but we have to work really, really hard to share them, to share those contacts, to make a kind of receptive audience for the articulations that, as we've all said, we need to get better at doing.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to give Jeremy the last word here.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I just wanted to echo that and to make a point about we're being pitched as against each other by the system as competitors, which I find deeply depressing. And perhaps scholarly associations are one way we can circumvent that competition and work together. And I think if to end on a positive, I think that's the way forward for us. And I really like this momentum to be carried through. So thanks very much for putting this panel together. It's got some great outcomes, hopefully, potentially. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, I mean, thanks so much to everybody, to our panelists, to everyone who's chimed in suggestions and comments in the chat. Gail's saying that Shared Futures is all about working together, and I think that's right. And it feels very powerful to be ending this panel on, I think, such a sense of shared common purpose, a sense of very clearly, actually, what these two massively central agenda items are that all the organizations present are aware of and want to kind of commit to going forward, but also that talking together is Katie's point taken about talking with people outside, absolutely, but that there's a lot to be learned from talking to each other on the way forward. It's been hugely inspiring to hear all of you talk about how you've led or kind of encouraged your organizations to work through the last year. And I think we're lucky as a discipline to have such kind of great and kind of committed people in the ecology of it. So thank you very much. It's 12:05 and I've been asked to suggest that we take a 5-minute break before the next panel for reasons of comfort or just getting a break from the screen. But I look forward to seeing everyone back at 10 past for what I think is going to be a really incredibly powerful final session. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex, for chairing it. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Hi everyone, welcome back to our final session, where we are very lucky to have Raj Pal and Corinne Fowler in conversation with each other. Raj is an independent curator and historian who's worked to bring about change in cultural institutions through witty and imaginative curations. And Corinne is here as well, fresh from a fantastic inaugural lecture at Leicester last night, which was hugely enjoyable. Corinne is the director of the Colonial Countryside National Trust Houses Reinterpreted project, and she was co-editor of the report that came out of that project. And she's also the author of Green Unpleasant Land, which I have here, very beautiful book, Creative Responses to Rural England's Colonial Connections. And I'm going to be talking about the book and Corinne's other work for about half an hour, and then there'll be a chance to have a discussion with them. As ever, if you want to put questions in the chat as we're going through, I'll pick them up at the end and invite you to speak if we've got some time to do that. So Raj and Corinne, welcome and thank you very much for being here. Raj, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry. I was just going to say all of what you said about Corinne is obviously on her way to becoming woman of steel, mist of the universe, and vanquisher of all evil on the planet. And in all of that, she's written, I think, an absolutely fantastic and groundbreaking work. I don't think it's gone down very well with a lot of people. I can't see Corinne easily being on David Starkey's Christmas list. And I just want to start by asking Corinne, we'll come to other questions about how the book has been received so far in the wider kind of academic and non-academic world.
Well, funnily enough, I never envisaged this as really having much academic impact because it was a book very much written for a general audience. But actually, it does seem to have had quite an academic impact amongst archaeologists and all kinds of people who are interested in local history, for example, who are saying, well, gosh, you know, actually, if you look at the history of ideas about the countryside, you really do have to examine literature, and it's really productive to look at the history of empire through the local history lenses in a way that lots of historians have done long before me, people like Kate Donington and so on. But actually, because the book, just by pure chance, was published in the middle of this storm about the National Trust report, as you know, the book's title was taken very ill by lots of opinion columnists and things, and they saw it as evidence of my anti-patriotic feeling that I'd called it Green Unpleasant Land. But actually I called it that because I was trying to show that it was a disruptive book in many ways, in thinking slightly differently about the English countryside and its connection to empire, really.
So I'm assuming therefore that you take your title of woke academic very seriously then.
Oh yeah, it's a true badge of pride, woke professor.
I mean, first of all, I've really thoroughly enjoyed this book for the reason that I think it's a very iconic book in the sense that, I mean, I was kind of brought up, you know, the bit that really opened my eyes to the English countryside was E.P. Thompson, who is, to my eyes, one of the first writers to have really brought in that element of class in the reshaping, class enclosures, dispersal of communities, etc., denial of traditional rights, etc., into the reshaping of the countryside. So there's no timelessness about the English countryside. And I think that's the beauty of your book. But yours is the first book that I know of, first substantial piece of work that I know of, which also then expanded beyond class into the colonial and slavery connection that you put at the heart of this very long process. Could you tell us a little bit more about what took you towards that particular direction?
It's interesting actually, because when you write a book, it's the result of a combination of people. And my editor, Jeremy Pointing at People Tree Press, was really, really important to the development of that book. He wasn't just going to take my manuscript and do a bit of tweaking. I had to rewrite that book because of him, and I'm really grateful for it, because he, like you, was extremely interested in the repressed working class history of the countryside. And he kept saying, but let's look a bit more at this anti-pastoral tradition, which of course Raymond Williams looked at in his book Country in the City. But I was already aware, because of the brilliant historical work by lots of people into between the connections between rural industry and rural poverty and empire. And there are so many examples, and the more you start looking, the bigger the story you realize it is. And I think it's important to talk about the connection between rural poverty and enclosure and slave ownership, plantation ownership, East India Company officials, and the fact that it was often the same men who were coming back with all this wealth, who were throwing people off the common land and taking advantage of the acts of enclosure. But it's also true that there are so many links which people are exploring between, for example, copper and the trade on the west coast of Africa, and wool even. There's some brilliant work by Chris Evans on the Welsh Plains and how important Welsh Plains were to that story of the so-called triangular trade. So I think that one of the reasons it's important to actually talk about this is because there's a bit of a thing happening in the public domain, an objection to talking about this history, which I describe as either-orism. Either you talk about the oppression of working people in this country, or you talk about the history of empire, but it doesn't need to be either or, it can be both. And I think that that's why I'm so glad that I managed to incorporate that into my book, thanks to people like Jeremy Pointing.
I'm sort of slightly going to a slightly different direction. When I look at the hostility, let's talk about a little bit about this little-known report that you wrote on the National Trust colonialism and slavery connection, and how it was received. But before you say anything, when I read the book, my first thought was, damn, she's written that report, and now she's napalmed Arcadia. It's a little bit like killing Bambi's mother. Yeah. So how has that stuff? How's the double whammy kind of gone down with you?
At first it was a bit of a shock, because I thought I knew it was going to be difficult when the National Trust released its report, and I'm sure the National Trust knew it was going to be difficult. But we didn't know how difficult, and we didn't know what a storm it would cause. And there was a sense that I was a big spoilsport. But actually, when I sat back and thought about it, I thought, well, why is this so sensitive? And I think one of the reasons it's so sensitive is that rurality and the countryside is so close to ideas about Englishness in particular, and Britishness in general, but particularly Englishness, that it sort of seems to strike at the soul of people's identification with a kind of or nostalgia about the past that Raymond Williams was so brilliant at talking about. So I think that was part of it, but I also think it was the timing of it, because it was a very sensitive moment where there had just been a real challenge to the Britain's versions of its past by the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer. And I think that was a shock to lots of people, because they hadn't kind of realised at all. But in addition to that, I think it came on top of the COVID crisis, where people were seeking refuge amongst the kind of green trees and glades and meadows and everything that they could do to make their lives more peaceful and less stressful. And it was very difficult for people to hear that, and neither should I expect, you know, a journey that's taken me many years for other people who don't specialize in that area to suddenly take it on board in the middle of a national crisis. So I do understand why it was such a huge deal.
I mean, there's an assumption which I want you to address, which I want you to come to, that the notion of the English countryside is just within England or within Britain. It's not. I mean, it's as we've talked about before, there is a certain kind of vicarious enjoyment of the ideal of the English countryside that goes beyond England. I mean, what I mean by that is that, just to slightly paraphrase Chinua Achebe and others, you know, my generation, for instance, who grew up, so I grew up in India. I mean, we were fed a diet of daffodils, and it's only when I came to England as a teenager later on that I discovered Wordsworth's other kind of poetry, but you know, about the French Revolution and so on and so forth. So I place him as a poet in that sort of broader context of someone who's disappointed, whose disappointment at the world that's unleashed by the French Revolution leads him towards this kind of pastoral kind of real kind of obsession with the countryside beauty, etc. What I'm trying to get at is that how do you think that affects perceptions of the English countryside beyond England?
I think it'd be brilliant to do a whole study on people's perceptions of the English countryside from all over the world. It'd be brilliant. But I think that it does come through in writing about the English countryside that people like Grace Nichols, like V.S. Naipaul, are already well acquainted, even though they're growing up outside England, they were already so well acquainted with the English landscape because, as you say, they've been fed this diet of daffodils, and they were reading all kinds of texts about the English countryside and not reading about Caribbean flowers or, you know, any of the other stuff. As I was saying last night, that I think it's quite interesting in V.S. Naipaul, particularly in The Enigma of Arrival, which was from 1987. He was spending 11 years walking through Wiltshire, and you can see that he's really influenced by Wordsworth in the way that he walks, these solitary walks through the countryside. He kind of takes up a bit of a Wordsworthian posture, and he embraces the tradition on the one hand, but another part of him is really quite cynical about the way in which that tradition has misled him. So people that he sees, I think there's someone called Jack that he initially assumes is, you know, of that place and was born in that place, but actually finds he commuted from the urban centre somewhere, and he didn't belong to that landscape any more than Naipaul belonged to it. At the same time, I think there was an overlaying in his book, which is also quite common in lots of other writing, of Caribbean scenes, well, scenes from Trinidad with English scenes. So at one point he talks about plants that have sprung across a path, and he compares it to fire jumping a path in Trinidad on the sugarcane fields. So I think that way of looking at the countryside is quite common, to kind of almost superimpose one's landscape over the other, and to be always conscious that you're seeing the English landscape through the way it's been mediated by artists like Constable, for example, talks a lot about Constable.
There's also certain ideology to it. It's also, I mean, I feel, for instance, my father's generation, there was about inanities like an Englishman's home is his castle, and that's just one. There are many, many others. And so first of all, when I came to England, I had been brought up on that, as I said, that diet of daffodils and Charles Dickens and so on and so forth. And it came as a shocker to me that most English people that I met on a daily basis had absolutely no idea of the England that I knew of, which I didn't see around me. And what I'm trying to get at is I want you to sort of comment on this, see what you feel about it. I've always felt, I've often felt that this kind of notion of the English countryside, this idealized notion of the English countryside, that my father's generation or my generation in the colonies were taught, was also kind of almost kind of like a sense of control. It was almost like a sense of ideological control to reshape our opinion and then our subservient relationship to England. Look at this ideal, this really beautiful Arcadian countryside. And I'm probably not expressing myself too well, but I'm just trying to kind of coax you into thinking, do you feel it's that relationship of using the idea of the English countryside as a form of kind of almost sort of like ideological control?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm really glad that I did a long and quite extended chapter on the idea of the pastoral and the origins of that kind of those ideas, the idea of Arcadia, the idea of the retreats from the countryside. I mean, there's actually some really good work done on, you mentioned Wordsworth, retreating to the countryside. There's some really, really good work done by, gosh, her name escapes me, just I'm trying to remember it, it'll come back to me, about Wordsworth and the fact that when he goes to London, he seems intimidated by the cosmopolitan nature of it. It's not just that he wants to escape from the ugliness of industrialization. He actually wants to retreat. There's an implication he wants to retreat from that kind of that sort of culture shock of being in London in such a cosmopolitan space. He does write about it in his other poetry. And but yeah, I mean, getting back to your larger points, yeah, I think it's a kind of illusion, isn't it, that the anti-pastoral poets very strongly challenged, and that is still, and yet still has currency and an emotional resonance for lots of people today. But not having experienced a colonial education, I can only really comment very indirectly on what other people have said about it. And I think Grace Nichols is really good about it in the introductions to one of her collections of poems, when she talks about how it wasn't by studying all that English literature, it's what she lost by not studying the literature from her own region.
We've had a very interesting observation from Delia D'Souza Correa, who says people growing up outside Britain are indeed often immersed in accounts of the English countryside, and this is the interesting bit, and in turn this shapes their perception of their own landscapes. And she goes on to reference Janet Frame's account for childhood and other stuff. So it's interesting that this idea has traction, wider traction than I'd assumed. Corinne, I just want to sort of take a bit of a sideways move at the moment. As I alluded earlier on, the report that you wrote on the slavery and colonial connection of some of the National Trust properties, as you well know, and as we both well know, it aroused an awful lot of hostility to you in particular, and to the cultural sector in general. So how do you think the sector, particularly the museum sector, ought to respond or not to respond?
Well, I think that people have a duty to respond to what is essentially there's been a long silence about these connections, less so in museums, but certainly in the heritage sector. And I think that once you know something, you can't unknow it. And it was really important that the National Trust put out that report, because it wasn't that it got the ball rolling, but in one sense it did get the ball rolling, because it came out at a time when people were already quite focused on reassessing the way in which heritage is presented to us. And obviously country houses as has been said, you know, the jewel in the crown in the heritage crown, the jewel in the heritage crown. So it's quite difficult to talk about these things if those sites have become places of pleasure and leisure. I suppose there's an anxiety. Well, do people want to hear about this kind of history? But there is a responsibility that as curators, as museum professionals, heritage professionals, and also teachers, to talk about history that is relevant to those sites. So, you know, places like Basildon Park that was built with East India Company money. Why would you not mention that that whole place exists because of an East India Company history and all of the wealth that flowed in because of that? It would be remiss not to mention it because you're worried about annoying a few visitors. And I think that ultimately the main lesson of all this is not to be timid, because being timid really makes things worse. It's if you're going to do this, you absolutely have to do it with sort of courage and resolve. And yeah, it was quite encouraging to see Kew Gardens and the director of Kew Gardens coming out with a clear and unequivocal statement. And you shouldn't apologise for doing the right thing, because it absolutely is the right thing to do, especially when you think about our children and our children's generation. This history is very, very resonant for many of them.
I mean, I felt at the time, when he came out, as it were, and said, look, when you're talking about racism, slavery, colonialism, you can't say we're not taking sides. You can't say we are neutral. And I felt that he really, by doing so, and the prominent position of his own position, but also his institution, I mean, I just felt that he just really drove a stake through the whole heart of this argument of being neutral. I mean, how on earth do you stay neutral when you walk past evil, for goodness sake? You know, so I struggle with this notion of why, you know, when I think of the complicity after the Second World War, the Germans were accused of, that they just walked past, even if you believe that they were ignorant, that many of them would have seen what was going on. And if we didn't accept that, why do we accept in this sense? I want to come back again. So, you know, your book in that case, do you think that it has any particular relevance to the challenges that I think, I mean, apart from its own intrinsic beauty and its originality, do you think it has any particular relevance to the challenges that the sector faces?
My book?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the book puts out a case for doing it and shows that neutrality is not a viable position, and it also explains the relevance of the history to. I don't talk about museums so much, although I do talk about collections a little bit, because a lot of heritage sites do have museums within them. I mean, you and I know about the museum at Kettleston Hall, the so-called Eastern Museum of items that were collected by Curzon, the Viceroy of India, and then there's that collection at Powis Castle. And so I think the curators are well aware that they have these items in their collections, and they also know about the history. So my book was really, saying that we need to address it, and now is the time to address it, and providing a rationale for doing so. But I tried to do it as comprehensively as I could. I didn't manage to fit the Lake District into my book, although I mentioned it last night in my inaugural lecture, because I think that the more you look, the more you find how relevant this history is, and it's just a way of looking. So in a way, the contribution of my book is to say, well, let's think in this way, let's look in this way, and then it opens up this history or that history. And in particular, I wanted to show the importance of local history for bringing out the detail and significance and complexity and nearness of the history of empire to local places.
Oh, sorry, I lost.
I frozen now.
No, I slightly lost you. Just that's fine. I remember and you really remember the initial reaction to the report. It was a veritable tsunami that really just one-off thing. It just kept coming and coming and coming, and you were the receiving end of it. Do you feel now, after a few months, that there has been some change, and also the reaction to the book? Do you feel that there is some sort of relationship to that? Any change? Any sort of connection?
Yeah, definitely. I do feel there's been a shift now, and it was well worth, standing firm, because, and again, that's what I mean, that you can't be timid in these things. You have to challenge the challenge. You have to, when something is unreasonable, that newspaper coverage, first of the National Trust report, but then of me in particular and the colonial countryside historians, it just got really, really vicious. And there was no right of reply, and it was a little bit like a juggernaut coming down at us on the pavement. When you're standing on the pavement, there's a juggernaut coming towards you. It just shouldn't have been on the pavement in the first place. It was really, really unjust and unfair. But I think that by pushing back, by making the case, by remaining calm and responding to the criticisms with patience and a little bit of compassion as well, realizing that there was a perceived threat which wasn't a real threat, but I think that the case was made, and there were certain things that really helped. So when the Charity Commission was asked to investigate the National Trust for researching its own properties, the Charity Commission did vindicate the National Trust, and then a Freedom of Information request showed that there were only ever 3 complaints to the Charity Commission about the National Trust report in the first place. So much for a barrage of complaints that activated that investigation. It was very much because of political pressure. And now they were accusing us of being politically motivated academics. And it was the most unbelievable case of gaslighting ever. In fact, the Daily Mail once accused me of gaslighting for defending myself in The Guardian, in very mild terms, I have to say. And so I think that there's that side of things. But then also what really helped was that the sector itself pushed back. So the Museums Association said, we will continue the decolonising work. It's really, really important, and we have the backs of all the curators who are working on decolonising projects. And then the Royal Historical Society and most of the historical associations in the country wrote an open letter to the Times in support of colonial countryside and all sensitive histories. And after that, it went pretty quiet, because I think people like the leader of the Common Sense group, Sir John Hayes, were beginning to look silly when they were saying things like, we should shred the Historic England report on the slavery connections of villages and churches and the built heritage. So I think that actually, in terms of the argument and the sort of rational argument, it has definitely been won. But I think it's really important also not to see this in terms of a battle. I mean, it was so vicious that many, many battle metaphors came to my mind, and I couldn't get rid of battle metaphors. And I kept thinking, this is not a battle. It's about enriching our collective understanding and doing it quietly, compassionately, and with a full knowledge that one of the reasons that this seemed so threatening was partly because the education system had not equipped all of us to understand these aspects of our past. And I think it's important to acknowledge that.
I mean, I saw your, I watched you and listened to your inaugural address last night, and it was, and I think the way that you, the way that you wove this intricate tapestry that really linked. I mean, you took Wordsworth as your sort of like it's like a painting. The Wordsworth was the main character right in the center of your painting, and then you sort of wove a narrative around him, which with evidence brilliantly showed that in that world, so many people who we assume had nothing to do with colonialism or with slavery were actually, in a sense, connected to it. I mean, Britain is the inventor of the notion of the joint stock company. You could be living in Birmingham, be a James Watt, and invest in the East India Company, have no idea how your money's being used, and you're just interested in the profits. And that just makes me question. Do you think many of the critics, I mean, particularly the so-called common sense nonsense group of MPs, I mean, do they really read anything? Do you think they have any sense of history? Do you think they have any sense of have they read anything?
No, sometimes it was hard to believe they could possibly have read the National Trust report, certainly not in full, but they must have done, although surely they wouldn't have invested so much time in tearing it down. But I think the striking thing about the National Trust report and the Historic England report is that nobody was actually contesting the facts. Nobody was actually saying, oh, well, you said this, but that's actually factually incorrect, because it was all referenced, footnoted, and you could look up the entry if you wanted in the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database or the slavevoyages.org database or this book or that book. And in fact, someone actually attacked the National Trust report because it had so many footnotes on the basis that it couldn't be proper research. It had loads of footnotes. And
you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.
It was derivative. So, I mean, that's one of my favorite criticisms, because I just think, well, that why would you see that as a weakness when you're referencing the fine peer-reviewed work of lots of other people and providing footnotes so that people could look at the evidence themselves? But I think, that was a pretty interesting criticism. But it's also important to say, and David Olusoga and others very kindly pointed this out, that one of the reasons we were attacked so viciously was partly to do with being female academics, and the patronising tone and the insulting tone was hard to miss, and it was very annoying to have our photographs published in the Daily Mail again and again, having photos taken off Facebook with me with a bird on my head to make me look ridiculous. It's just a lack of respect that was shown is amusing on one level, and I did sort of laugh on one level, but on another level, I think it was absolutely right that women who are working in this area, and people of colour worse, really sort of, well, I don't want to use a battle metaphor, but they have a hard time.
But I just on that, just since you are on that train of thought, I just want you to address this. I mean, it is my observation that, and I can understand why we are, we are supposed to be grateful. We're not supposed to be questioning British history, as it were. And I can understand, therefore, when Black and Asian or people, academics, writers, etc., of color, when they're criticized about questioning our heritage, as it were, our history, English history, because, as I said, we are supposed to be grateful. We've been given a place in this country, and we should be grateful for what we have. I've also noticed, though, Corinne, also that yes, while white academics, male academics, when they write similar stuff, they don't really get it in the neck. However, as well as women of color, when it is white women who write on the sort of stuff that you have written, they really get it in the neck. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there is a history of, you know, in colonial thinking. It's just one of those legacies of empire in a way, isn't it? If I don't want to exaggerate it, but I think that white women have often been symbols of, you know, the symbols of English culture, which must not be violated. And obviously, if you participate in some criticism of the received ideas of British history, then obviously you're going to be seen in some way by some quarters as somehow a traitor, in the way that, you know, I was thinking about the so-called Indian Mutiny, or the conflict of 1857, and the fact that there were so many stories in the newspapers about Indians raping white women, certainly not any stories about the other way around. And it was all about violating our culture, that women are somehow carriers of the culture. It's a kind of recurrent theme in nationalist ideas generally, but apparently, well, I did speak to many experts who came running to my aid, and one of them was an expert in nationalism across Europe and Australia and the US, and she told me that what was happening to me was happening to women all over Australia, the US and Europe, because of the rise of nationalism. It does lash out not just at people of colour, but also women.
I want to come to something personal to me that you actually touched on in your inaugural lecture last night. My first university was Lancaster University, where I went as a mature student, and as you know, Sambo's grave, the grave of this young boy, this young African boy who died and was basically buried at the edge of this marsh, as opposed to consecrated ground, because he hadn't been baptized, lies there, and for many years, centuries, neglected and sort of unsaid, and so on and so forth. And I took my son, my wife and I, we took our son to visit that, and he laid a bouquet of flowers, daffodils as it happens, at that extremely well-tended grave now. And the thing that really astonished me was how many children come to visit and have messages, returns, etc. But you know, when I was a student, the notion of, you know, I taught economic and social history, which English economic and social history. But I was never taught in turn that somehow all this stuff that we were talking about, industrialization, the cotton trade and tobacco and sugar, etc., that somehow colonialism and slavery were the drivers of all of this. And then to go to Sambo's grave and see it like that now, it was a very emotional experience. And I just want to ask you, what is it, what was it that has made things so much more different now? And I mean, I know the broader context is Black Lives Matter, but how is it that for centuries we've been able to neglect that, but now, today, we are discussing this to the great alarm of many?
I think it is to do with children in one sense. I would give that answer, wouldn't I? Because obviously I've got my project Colonial Countryside, and I worked with 100 children, and then extended that to more children after that. But one thing that is quite clear is that generation is more connected to the rest of the world than any previous generation. And not only that, those children are all mixing with one another and learning about the world through each other, going into each other's houses, and they're playing the same football teams or whatever. They're all in the same clubs. I think it's really, really important, because it's through those emotional bonds that things change. And one sort of interesting little anecdote, that I was talking to somebody who is probably of my uncle's generation after the inaugural lecture. And it was an email exchange, but he was saying, well, you know, it was provoking in a good way. It sort of made me think in a good way. But actually, my grandchildren go to museums, and when I go there, because my grandchildren have a Guianan heritage, that I really care about what kind of history they're learning and what kind of objects they're looking at. And it's those affective bonds, it's those family relationships and friendships that are opening up those histories of the rest of the world and Britain's relationship to the rest of the world in our own minds. So I think that that's really a very important aspect of the nation's readiness through the grandchildren and through those family bonds to talk in a more open way and an honest way about our past for the sake of that generation.
Gail, can I ask if we have any questions that we want addressed to Corinne?
That's exactly what I was coming on the screen to ask. If anybody has questions, if you want to raise your hand, that would be really helpful. I mean, I've got lots, but I don't want to hog space. And I know quite a lot of people in the room have got to be off at 1 o'clock. So, so anybody wants to pop their hand up, or indeed put a question in the chat if your mic's not
Please
working.
do, because otherwise Corinne and I could chat for hours.
Yeah. Well, we could listen to you for hours. That's the problem, I think. Perhaps while people are gathering their thoughts, because it was so fascinating to listen to, Corinne, the subtitle of the book is Creative Responses, and I suspect you did the cover, and there are also some poems of yours at the back as well. And I just wondered if you could say something about the importance of the poems and the importance of having that creative response from you as well as the historical and literary response.
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I felt that I didn't want to write a dry academic book about this history without acknowledging the emotional dimension of that history and the fact that it is sensitive history, that it involves trauma. And so I really felt that while I was conscious that while I was researching the book, I was busy writing poems and stories about the history in a way that really honoured the people who were missing from the historical records or who had done a disservice in the historical records. And it was just a way of showing respect through writing in a different way, in a more emotional and emotive way, I suppose, about that history. So it was, yeah, so in a way it's a critical, creative book. We don't really talk much about that part of the book, but there are so many more stories that could be written, but the book itself was really trying to make an ethical decision in including that kind of writing in the book.
And it really works as well. And I love the kind of ventriloquizing, the bringing voices back from the past, which quite a lot of the poems are doing, aren't they? Which is really exciting. I was wondering as well, I'm just going to carry on if nobody else is going to put their hands up, because I'm so excited by reading the book. And I remember talking to you about this ages ago when we were both at Leicester. So it's just brilliant to see it come to fruition now. But there's something particularly interesting about. Say again? A while ago.
Finally, yeah, it took a while.
Let's not go there. There's a question about John Clare. I know we've got Simon Kaveshi in the room, and I hope this isn't putting him on the spot too much, but you say about Clare's trying to find his voice, his struggle to speak in his own voice. You suggest that's a precursor of Black British poets of our time trying to find their voices too, and of regional writers throwing off the sense that their writings of strictly local appeal. And I thought that was such an interesting, I think you mentioned the connection with contemporary Black British writers elsewhere too. And I just wonder if you could say something about that, because that really effectively politicises what you're finding going back to the past, into that pastoral tradition.
Yeah, definitely, because I think John Clare is such, obviously we all know, how important retrospectively John Clare is as a figure, and the fact that he had that really refined vocabulary, because he was responding to the world which was immediately around him. And when it comes, I mean, one big theme of my book is actually rural racism and the idea that people of colour have no right to either be in the countryside and certainly not to trespass into producing rural writing. And yet it's that devolved engagement with local countryside settings which you find in so much rural writing by British Black and British Asian writers, that is just so overlooked. And that's why I've been talking for a while about the rural turn in writing by British Black and British Asian authors, and the fact that since the 1980s, this writing has increasingly focused on the countryside, but it's somehow been missed until recently. And I suppose John Clare was an outsider, or a perceived outsider, in the way that and also it's just about class also, and about sort of where you fit in the social order, and whether you have the right to produce creative work about the countryside at all, or the perceived right, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just on that, Corinne, something we've discussed before, the unease that people of color feel about accessing, about going to the countryside. I mean, I have a confession to make. I find it really difficult to go enjoy the countryside alone. I always feel I need white friends or white family members to be with me. I've struggled to try and explain this, but I want to hear what your views are. Yeah, I won't be at that. Yes, yeah.
Well, I mean, that is why I tried to bring together the work by Neil Chakrabarty and others on rural racism, and the fact that this is not a figment of people's imagination, the staring, the over-smiling, or even the open hostility when a person of colour enters the countryside. It's often not a comfortable experience. So, and that's been reported on and evidenced extensively by a range of reports which are really quite detailed on all regions, Cumbria, the southwest. There's loads of evidence out there to show this, that it's not some imagined phenomenon, that uneasiness that you mentioned.
Gail, over to you again.
Oh, sadly, we are getting very, very close to our deadline. Delia's just put a comment in the chat about visiting National Trust properties, thinking about class and race, and Delia says it means that properties that elide their colonial history are so off-putting that people want to go home. So wouldn't the NT increasingly lose its audiences if it didn't bring these to light? Grounds for optimism, perhaps, hopefully. It would be lovely to talk to Delia, who's also got a different kind of upbringing in New Zealand. It would be lovely to hear more about that, but I'm very aware we've got 3 minutes left and lots of people do need to disappear at 1 o'clock precisely. So I think we have to wrap it up. That was such a great conversation to listen to. Thank you very much, both of you. And I'm really inspired by the conversation, inspired by your example, Corinne, as always. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for asking us.
My pleasure. So let's hand over to Bob for a few words.
I'm just going to thank all our speakers, particularly that last fantastic session, all our speakers, all our chairs. I'd like to thank Becky from the English Association again for her fantastic work. And I'd like to thank all the organisations involved, not only all the learned societies that came and spoke today, but also the Institute of English Studies, National Association of Writers in Education, National Association of Teachers of English, University English, and of course the English Association. So thank you all very much indeed. Great morning, Gail.
Yeah, thank you. I think what I've taken away from this is that however difficult the last year has been, and it has been difficult in personal ways and institutional ways for lots and lots of people, there is something very strong and very important about what we're doing, partly because we have access to literature, and then that's been incredibly important for all the ways that Tina and Ben have been articulating, but it also gives me gives me hope for the future, because I think what we do sustains an awful lot of people. It sustains us. And there is strength in doing what we're doing this morning and keeping each other company and talking and making sure we've got the structures and the energy to maintain our subject in a really difficult time. So thank you very much, everyone, for being part of this morning, and we will be in touch as soon as we possibly can about our next event in a couple of months' time. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great bank holiday weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.